Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was July of 1868. And the heat was a thick, wet blanket you couldn't shake off. I was just a young man then, Mr. Junior Anderson, spending the summer on Little Manitou Island in Lake Michigan. My father had business with the fishing company that operated a small outpost there, and he'd brought me along, thinking the fresh air and hard work would be good for me. The island wasn't much, a rocky piece of land covered in dense, dark pine and cedar, with a smell of damp earth and rotting wood that never really left your clothes. That particular day started like any other. The air was so still, you could hear the flies buzzing 100 yards off. Me and the other men, there were 4 of us in the party, were supposed to be checking the nets on the North Shore. It was tedious work, hauling in the lines, your fingers getting numb and raw from the cold lake water, even in the summer. We'd been at it since just after sunup, and the morning had bled into a sluggish, hot afternoon. I remember I was just leaning against a gnarled old pine, taking a swig of warm water from my canteen, when Elijah, one of the older fishermen, went stiff. He held up a hand, his eyes wide, staring off into the wall of trees behind us. "You hear that?" he whispered, and his voice was so tight it didn't sound like his own. We all went quiet. At first, there was nothing but the gentle lap of water on the rocks and the sigh of the wind through the pines. Then I heard it. It wasn't an animal sound, not like a wolf or a bear. It was a kind of whimper, a low, guttural moaning that rose and fell like a person in terrible pain, but deeper, rougher. It was a sound that had no business being out here, in this empty place. It made the hair on my arm stand straight up. Elijah pointed a trembling finger towards the woods. Saw something move back in there. Big dark. We all crowded together, peering into the shadows between the trees. The forest was a tangled mess, all fallen logs and thick underbrush. You couldn't see more than 20 feet in, but then something shifted. It wasn't a deer. It was taller, much taller, and it moved on 2 legs. It was just a flash of dark, shaggy hair between the tree trunks, and then it was gone. But in that second, I got a sense of its size. It was huge. My mind tried to make it a bear, but bears don't stand up and walk like that, not for long, and they aren't 8 feet tall. A cold dread, different from any fear I'd ever known, settled in my gut. This wasn't right. This was all wrong. We stumbled back to our main camp, a rough collection of tents near the beach, our voices overlapping, everyone talking at once. The initial fear had been joined by a kind of wild, nervous energy. We had to do something. We couldn't just sit there after hearing that, after seeing that thing. It felt like a violation, like the island itself had just shown us a secret it was never meant to reveal. We decided to organize a search. It sounds foolish now, a bunch of fishermen with a couple of old rifles thinking they could track down whatever that was. But at the time, it felt necessary. We had to know, we had to see it, to prove to ourselves we weren't all going mad from the isolation. We split into 2 pairs. I was with a man named Thomas, a quiet, steady fellow. We took the shoreline, thinking that whatever it was might be traveling along the water's edge. The other 2, Elijah and my father, went into the deeper woods. The plan was to sweep around and hopefully flush it out towards the beach. The sun was beginning its slow slide down the sky, casting long, distorted shadows from the trees that made every stump and rock look like a crouching figure. The air grew cooler, but the chill I felt had nothing to do with the temperature. Thomas and I walked in silence, our boots crunching on the gravel and sand. We'd been at it for what felt like an hour, our eyes scanning the tree line, our ears straining for any sound out of the ordinary. All we heard was the lake, Then we came around a bend, a small secluded cove we called Whisper Bay because of the way the wind sounded there. And that's where I saw him. He was down on the beach, maybe 50 yards away, kneeling at the water's edge. My breath caught in my throat. For a second, my brain refused to make sense of the shape. It was a man, but it wasn't. He was massive, his back broad and covered in a thick, matted coat of dark brown hair, almost black in the fading light. His limbs were long and powerfully built. He was washing his feet in the lake water, cupping his hands and pouring water over them with a slow, deliberate motion. It was such a human gesture, so ordinary, that it was more terrifying than any monster roar could have been. I froze, my hand tightening on the stock of my rifle. Thomas had seen him too. I heard his sharp intake of breath beside me. The creature, the wild man, was completely unaware of us. The wind was in our favor, blowing from him towards us. I could see the muscles in his back and shoulders working under the shaggy pelt of hair. He was real. He was right there. I don't know what came over me. Some stupid, reckless courage, maybe, or maybe just the desperate need to get closer, to understand. I took a step forward, then another. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. I was maybe 30 yards away when my boot scuffed a loose stone. His head snapped up. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. He turned his head and looked right at me, and I saw his face. It wasn't the face of a beast. It was intelligent. His eyes were a deep, dark brown, set under a heavy, sloping brow. They held a sharp, piercing awareness that was utterly shocking. He had a broad, flat nose and a wide mouth. His hair wasn't just long. It was a wild, frizzy mane that stuck out in all directions around his head and down his neck, tangled with leaves and bits of twig. There was dirt smeared on his high cheekbones. He looked ancient and wild. And in that single, heart-stopping moment, I saw not just surprise in his eyes, but a deep, profound fear. He let out a sound, not a roar, but a sharp, panicked huff of air. And he moved. I have never, before or since, seen anything move that fast. He didn't just stand up, he sprang from his kneeling position to his full, terrifying height in one fluid, powerful motion. It was like watching a steel trap snap shut, but in reverse. 1 second he was on the ground, the next he was towering over the beach, all 8 feet of him, and then he was running. He didn't run like a man. It was a loping, ground-eating gallop, incredibly fast and unnervingly silent for his size. He headed straight for the tree line. My body acted before my mind could catch up. I raised my rifle, the old Springfield, my hands shaking so badly I could barely aim. I didn't think about killing him. I didn't think about anything. It was pure animal instinct. I fired. The crack of the rifle shot was deafening in the quiet cove. A puff of sand kicked up a good 10 feet behind him. I'd missed completely. He never broke stride. He vanished into the dark green of the pines, as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. One moment he was there, a massive, fleeing shape, and the next, there was nothing but the swaying branches where he disappeared. The silence that rushed back in was heavier and more oppressive than before. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Thomas was shouting something, but his voice sounded muffled and far away. My ears were ringing. I just stood there, the rifle still shouldered, staring at the empty spot where he had been. My legs felt like they were made of water. I could still see his face. Those intelligent, frightened eyes burned into the back of my own. The rest of the day was a blur. The other 2 men came crashing through the woods at the sound of the shot, their faces pale. We tried to follow his trail, but there was nothing. No footprints in the thick bed of pine needles, no broken branches. It was as if he'd never existed. We searched until the last bit of light was gone from the sky, and we were stumbling in the dark, our lanterns throwing crazy, dancing shadows that made us jump at every turn. We gave up. We had to. We made our way back to camp in a grim, silent group. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? We built a bigger fire than usual, and none of us slept much. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves outside the circle of firelight made my heart jump into my throat. The island no longer felt empty. It felt watched. It felt occupied. The next few days were tense. We stayed close to camp, our work half done. We'd hear things at night, heavy footsteps circling just beyond the light, deep guttural breaths from the darkness. It might have been our imaginations, fueled by fear, but it felt real. The terror of that moment on the beach, seeing that face, then seeing him move with such impossible speed, had left its mark on all of us. We were shaken to our cores. It was Elijah who, a couple of days later, brought up the old story. He said he'd heard it from a trapper years back. The story went that a family of settlers trying to cross the ice from the mainland to the island one winter many years ago had fallen through. They'd all been lost, including a young boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old. His body was never found. He just mentioned it offhand one evening by the fire. He didn't connect it to what we'd seen. He didn't have to. The idea just hung there in the air between us. A terrible unspoken question, a lost child, a wild man. The dates were fuzzy, the story just a rumor, but the seed was planted. Was it possible? Could a child, lost and alone, have survived out here? Could he have grown up, feral, in this wilderness, becoming the thing we saw? The thought was somehow more horrifying than any monster from a storybook. It meant the thing we'd seen, that powerful, terrifying creature, had once been a human boy. It meant the intelligence in its eyes had a human origin. The horror wasn't just in its wildness, but in its lost humanity. We never saw him again. We finished our work on the island and left at the end of the summer, and I never went back. My father sold his share in the fishing company not long after, but that day has never left me. It's been years, but I can still close my eyes and be right back on that beach. I can feel the crunch of the gravel under my boots, smell the wet stone and pine, see the way the late afternoon light caught the water dripping from his hairy legs. I can see him turn. I can see the startling clarity in his eyes, and I can feel the jolt of the rifle in my hands as I fired that useless, panicked shot. The failure to capture him, to even understand what he was, haunts me. It wasn't just that we failed. It was that the island and the thing living on it had defeated us completely. It showed us just a glimpse of its secret and then took it back, leaving us with nothing but questions and a cold, lingering fear that even now, all these years later, I can feel in the pit of my stomach when I think about it. I don't know what we saw that day. I don't know if it was a man, a monster, or something in between. I just know that I saw it, and I'll never forget the look on its face right before it ran, or the utter silence of the woods after it was gone. Story 2. Okay, so I'm just gonna dive right in because I need to get this out. I've been sitting on this for a while now, and every time I think about it, my stomach knots up. It happened about 2 months ago, on a Tuesday, if I remember right. It was one of those bright, sunny days in late spring where everything feels normal and safe, you know? The kind of day where you leave the windows open because the air smells like cut grass and the birds are chirping non-stop. My son, he's 8, was home from school for some teacher work day, so we were just hanging around the house. I was in the living room, sorting through some old photos, and he was at the kitchen table eating a peanut butter sandwich, like he does almost every day. Our house is pretty isolated, which we usually love. It's a small ranch-style place with a big backyard that slopes down into this dense patch of woods. The trees are mostly oaks and pines, thick enough that you can't see too far in, even in daylight. We've got a bird feeder out there, and sometimes deer wander through, but that's about it. Nothing weird, ever. That day the sun was high, probably around 1 in the afternoon, and the light was streaming into the kitchen, making the whole room feel warm and golden. I remember hearing the crunch of my son's chips and the faint hum of the refrigerator. normal stuff. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this frantic scraping sound, his chair legs scraping against the floor, and he came bolting into the living room. His face was pale, like he'd seen a ghost, and his eyes were wide, fixed on nothing. He was breathing hard, almost panting, and he grabbed my arm so tight his little fingers dug into my skin. "Mom, there's something out there," he stammered, his voice shaky. "In the woods. It wasn't a person, it was big, and it had this long arm." I tried to calm him down, you know. Parents do that. I thought maybe he'd seen a bear or a big dog. We get those sometimes, though rarely. But he was insistent, shaking his head, his whole body trembling. "No, it wasn't like that," he said, his words tumbling out. "It was behind the big oak tree, the one with the broken branch. I saw an arm, like really long, and then it stepped out a little. It was wide and dark, and it moved fast." He was so sure, and his fear was so raw, that it started to get to me. I could feel my own heart picking up speed, a dull thud in my chest. I followed him back to the kitchen, my legs feeling a bit wobbly. The table was still there, his half-eaten sandwich and a glass of milk sitting untouched. The window over the sink looked straight out into the backyard, and beyond that, the woods. I peered out, squinting against the sun. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze, leaves rustling the way they always do. The grass was a little long because I hadn't mowed it yet, and I could see the shadow of the house stretching toward the tree line. But no movement, no figures, nothing. My son was right beside me, clutching the edge of the counter. "It was right there," he whispered, pointing to the oak tree. "That tree is maybe 30 feet from the house, thick-trunked, with a low-hanging branch that snapped in a storm last year. It's one of those details you don't think about until something happens." He described how he'd been looking out, bored, just watching the leaves, when he saw a shift in the shadows. Then an arm, long, like way longer than a person's, reached out from behind the trunk. It was dark, almost black, and covered in what looked like hair or fur. He said it was thick, like a log, and it moved in a way that wasn't human. Then, for just a second, the figure stepped partly into view. He said it was huge, broader than a man, with shoulders that seemed to block the light. It didn't have a clear face, just a massive shape, and it was gone before he could blink. I kept staring out the window, my eyes scanning every inch of the woods. The sunlight was dappling through the leaves, creating shifting patterns, and for a moment I thought I saw something move near the base of the oak. But it was probably just a squirrel or the wind. I tried to rationalize it, you know. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or he'd fallen asleep for a second and dreamed it, but he was so adamant. And he's not a kid who makes things up. He's practical, like his dad, always looking for logical explanations. That's what made it so unsettling. I decided to go outside and check. I told him to stay in the kitchen, but he begged me not to go alone, so I let him follow me to the back door. I slid it open, and the warm air hit me, carrying the smell of pine and damp earth. The deck creaked under my feet, and I stepped down onto the grass. It was soft and a bit dewy from the morning. I walked slowly toward the tree line, my senses on high alert. Every little sound seemed amplified, the crunch of twigs under my shoes, the distant caw of a crow, the rustle of leaves. My skin felt prickly, like I was being watched. But I told myself it was just nerves. When I got closer to the oak tree, maybe 10 feet away, I stopped. The ground there is always a bit muddy, because it's shaded, and I could see our footprints from earlier in the week. But right near the base of the tree, there was something else, a patch of disturbed leaves and what looked like a deep impression in the soil. It was too big to be from a deer, more like something heavy had been standing there. The grass was flattened in a way that didn't look natural, and there were a few broken twigs scattered around. I bent down to look, and that's when I noticed the smell. It's hard to describe, but it was musky, almost like wet dog mixed with something rotten, but faint, like it had been there and faded. I've never smelled anything like that in our yard before. I stood up, my heart hammering now. I scanned the woods again, but it was just trees and shadows, stretching back into darkness. The sun was still bright, but under the canopy it felt dim and closed in. I called out, "Hello, is anyone there?" My voice sounded small and stupid, echoing a little. No response, just the wind picking up and making the branches sway. I could feel the hair on my arms standing up, and I had this urge to run back to the house, like something was about to jump out at me. I turned around and hurried back to the deck, my son waiting by the door, his eyes huge. He asked if I saw anything, and I shook my head, but I didn't tell him about the impression or the smell. I didn't want to scare him more. We went inside, and I locked the door, pulling the blinds shut on the kitchen window. The rest of the afternoon, we stayed in the living room, away from that side of the house. I tried to act normal, putting on a cartoon for him, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise made me jump. The house settling, a car driving by on the road out front, even the clock ticking on the wall. My son kept bringing it up, asking what I thought it was. I told him it was probably an animal, maybe a bear that wandered too close, but he wasn't buying it. He said, "Bears don't have arms that long, Mom," and it stood up like a person, but bigger. His certainty was chilling. I started thinking about all those stories online, the ones people laugh off as myths, but in that moment it didn't feel funny at all. I felt this deep, primal fear, like something had breached our safe little bubble. As the day wore on, the sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Around 5 o'clock, I had to take the trash out to the bin near the side of the house. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't let fear stop me from everyday things. I stepped outside, the air cooler now, and hurried to the bin. On my way back, I glanced toward the woods. The light was fading, turning everything grey and indistinct. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape move between the trees, a dark, hulking form that blended into the shadows. It was gone so fast I couldn't be sure, but my breath caught in my throat, and I ran back inside, my hands shaking so bad I fumbled with the lock. The rest of the evening we stayed in, and I kept all the lights on. My son fell asleep on the couch around 8, exhausted from the stress. I sat there watching him, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept peeking out the front window, but it was just the quiet street, neighbors' houses with their lights on, nothing out of the ordinary. But in the back of my mind, that image of the long arm and the wide figure kept replaying over and over. I finally went to bed around 11, but I didn't sleep much. Every creak of the house made me tense up, and I kept getting up to check the locks. At one point, I thought I heard a low sound from outside, like a deep grunt or something, but it was so faint I might have imagined it. The next morning, everything seemed normal again, but that day has stuck with me. I still avoid the backyard more than I used to, and my son gets nervous if he's alone in the kitchen. We've talked about it a few times, but neither of us has any answers. It's just this thing that happened, this glimpse of something we can't explain, and it left us both with this unease that hasn't really gone away. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to. Story 3. The chill that morning bit right through my layers, the kind of cold that settles deep in your bones and makes your joints ache. It was one of those late October mornings in Adams County, the sky just starting to lighten from black to a deep bruised purple. Sunrise was maybe 20 minutes away. I was in the passenger seat of my grandfather's old Ford pickup, the heater blasting, but only managing to take the real sharp edge off the cold. The smell in the cab was a familiar mix of old coffee, gun oil, and the faint, earthy scent of the tobacco he always chewed. We were headed to one of his spots, a huge open field that butted up against a thick, almost impenetrable wall of woods. It was a place he'd been hunting since he was a boy, and he knew every dip and roll of the land. We weren't after anything in particular that day. It was more about the ritual of it, getting out there, being quiet together, seeing what the dawn would bring. It was our thing. We parked the truck on a gravel pull-off, the tires crunching loudly in the absolute silence of the pre-dawn. The sound felt like a trespass. We got out, shouldered our rifles, and started the quiet walk through the stubbly, frozen grass to a small rise he liked. There was a natural depression there that worked as a perfect blind. We settled in, our backs against the cold, hard ground, and just waited. The only sounds were our own breathing, starting to steam in the air, and the distant, lonely call of a crow. That's when I saw them. The sun wasn't even fully up yet, just a sliver of fiery orange peeking over the horizon, painting the field in long, weak shadows. My eyes were scanning the tree line, about 150 yards away, looking for any movement, any shape that didn't belong. And then I saw two shapes that definitely did not belong. At first, my brain, trained by a lifetime of hunting, tried to make them into deer, maybe two big bucks standing on their hind legs fighting or something. But that thought evaporated in a split second. These weren't deer. They were way, way too tall, and they were walking upright, just like a person, but the proportions were all wrong. My breath hitched in my throat. I didn't say a word. I just slowly, so slowly, I was afraid the movement would be too loud, reached my elbow out and nudged my grandfather, who was lying right beside me. He grunted softly, a quiet question. I just lifted my chin, the smallest of gestures, pointing with my eyes toward the tree line. He shifted his head slightly, following my gaze. I heard the sharp, quiet intake of his breath. I glanced over at him. In the growing light, I saw the color drain from his face. This was a man who'd fought in a war, who'd faced down angry bulls, who'd never in all my life shown a flicker of fear. But right then, he was pale. His jaw was tight and his eyes were wide, fixed on the things in the distance. We both lay there, frozen, just watching. There were two of them. They were massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and these things had to be at least 1.5 feet, maybe 2 feet taller than me. They were covered in hair, a dark, shaggy brown that seemed almost black in the shadow of the woods. But as the first real rays of sunlight caught them, I could see it had a reddish tint to it, like a wet seal. It wasn't messy or clumpy like a bear's fur. It looked almost uniform, like a heavy coat. They were moving from our left to our right, heading towards a denser part of the forest. Their walk was what got me the most. It wasn't clumsy or shuffling, it was fluid, effortless. They moved with a smooth, powerful grace that was completely at odds with their size. A human that big would be lumbering, heavy-footed. These things just glided. Their arms swung naturally at their sides, and their heads were up, looking forward. They didn't seem to be in a hurry, but they covered ground fast. The silence was the worst part. We were in an open field. You should hear things. You should hear footsteps crunching on frozen grass, the rustle of fur against branches. Something. There was nothing. Just this profound, heavy silence that seemed to press down on us. It was like they were moving through the world without touching it. I could feel my heart hammering against the cold ground. My fingers, wrapped around the stock of my rifle, were numb, but I didn't dare move them. I was acutely aware of every little sensation, the cold seeping through my jacket into my chest, the dry taste of fear in my mouth, the way my own breathing sounded deafeningly loud in my ears. I was terrified that if I made any sound at all, they would turn and look at us. My grandfather was just as still. I could see the tension in his neck, the way his knuckles were white where he gripped his own rifle. He wasn't even breathing hard. He was just holding his breath, watching. This was a man who could identify any animal in these woods by the sound of its movement or the shape of its track. And he was staring at these things with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. It wasn't just surprise or curiosity, it was fear, a deep, primal fear that I felt echoing in my own gut. The things kept walking, their long, powerful strides eating up the distance to the tree line. The sun was a little higher now, and the light caught the sheen on their fur again. It wasn't just brown, It was layered with lighter shades underneath. I could see the powerful muscles in their shoulders and legs working with each step. They were built, not fat, not lanky, but solid, like athletes or something. They were close to the woods now, maybe 20 yards from the first trees. I remember thinking, just get to the trees, just disappear. I didn't want them to stop. I didn't want them to turn around. I just wanted them to be gone. And then, as if they'd heard my thought, the one in the front, the slightly taller one, reached the edge of the forest. It didn't push branches aside or struggle through the undergrowth. It just stepped into the shadows between two big oaks and was gone. It didn't break its stride. It just melted into the darkness. The second one followed a moment later, doing the exact same thing. One step it was there, a huge dark silhouette against the trees, and the next step it was swallowed up by the woods. Just like that, they were gone. The field was empty again. The same crows were cawing in the distance. The sun was now fully over the horizon, painting the field in a warm, golden light that felt completely wrong. It felt like the world should have changed, but it hadn't. It was just a field in Ohio. We didn't move. We lay there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 or 6 minutes. Neither of us said a word. We just stared at the spot where they'd vanished, half expecting them to come back out. But they didn't. The tree line was just a tree line again. Finally, my grandfather let out a long, shaky breath. It was the first real sound either of us had made since we saw them. He slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, his movements stiff like an old man's. I sat up too. My body was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable shake that started in my hands and ran all the way up my arms. I felt cold, but I was also sweating under my clothes. He looked at me, and his eyes were still wide. He didn't look like my grandfather right then. He looked like a stranger who had just seen a ghost. "You see that?" he asked, his voice a dry, husky whisper. I just nodded. I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight. He looked back at the woods, then down at his hands, then back at me. "What in God's name was that, boy?" I shook my head. I had no answer. My mind was racing, trying to fit what I'd just seen into a box I understood. A bear? No. Bears don't walk like that. They don't have that posture. A person in a suit. That was even more ridiculous. No suit moves with that kind of raw, powerful grace. And no one was going to be out here in the middle of nowhere at sunrise in a gorilla costume. It was insane. We gathered our stuff. The movements felt loud and clumsy now. The crunch of our boots, the rustle of our jackets, it all seemed to scream into the quiet morning. We didn't talk. We just walked back to the truck, both of us scanning the tree line constantly, our rifles held a little tighter, a little closer. The drive back was just as quiet. The heater was still going, but the cab felt different. The familiar smells were still there, but they were now layered over with the scent of our fear. My grandfather stared straight ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel at 10 and 2, his knuckles still white. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't say a word. I just looked out the window, watching the frozen fields and bare trees roll by, but I wasn't really seeing them. I was seeing those two dark figures moving with that impossible silent grace. We got back to his house. My grandma was in the kitchen making breakfast. The smell of bacon and coffee should have been comforting. It just made me feel sick. "You boys get anything?" she asked, cheerful. My grandfather just shook his head, hanging his coat on the hook by the door. "Not today," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her. We sat at the table. He poured himself a cup of coffee with a hand that wasn't quite steady. We ate in silence. Every time a floorboard creaked or the furnace kicked on, we both flinched. Later that day, when we were cleaning our guns in the garage, he finally spoke about it again. "Those weren't bears," he said, not looking up from the rifle barrel he was running a patch through. "I know," I said. "Men don't get that big, and they don't move like that." "I know." He was quiet for a long time. The only sound, the soft shush-shush of the cleaning rod. Then he said, almost to himself, "That was something else." That was the last time we ever talked about it directly. We went hunting together many more times after that. In that same field, in those same woods, we never saw anything like it again. No strange tracks, no broken branches, no sounds in the night. Nothing. It was like it never happened. But it did happen. I saw it. He saw it. And the memory of it is burned into my mind as clearly as anything in my life. It's not the fear that stays with me the most, though that was real enough. It's the silence. The way they moved through that frozen field without making a sound. The way they just stepped into the shadows and vanished, as if they were part of them. I've read the stories online since then. The Bigfoot accounts. The descriptions match. The size, the hair, the walk. Reading them sends a chill down my spine, because I know that those people aren't making it up. They saw what I saw, something that shouldn't exist but does, something that walks in the quiet places, just out of sight. And sometimes, when I'm in the woods by myself and the sun is going down, I'll get this feeling, this prickling on the back of my neck. I'll stop and listen, and the woods will go completely quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. And in that heavy silence, I remember the two of them moving as one. And I wonder if I'm being watched by something from the shadows, something that remembers me too. I never stay to find out. I just turn around and walk back to my truck a little faster than I should the whole way home. Story 4. It was October of 2018, and my family, my wife, our 2 kids, a boy and a girl, aged 9 and 7, decided we needed to get away. Life had been this constant grind of work, school, traffic and screens. We just wanted quiet, real quiet. So we found this cabin online, way up in northern Idaho, tucked so far back in the woods, the listing said you'd lose cell service about 20 minutes before you even reached the turnoff. It sounded perfect. The drive up was beautiful. The leaves were all these fiery colors, red and orange and yellow, and the air got colder and cleaner the higher we climbed. When we finally bumped down the long, rutted dirt driveway and saw the cabin, it was exactly what I'd pictured. A simple, square log structure with a steep-pitched roof to shed the snow, a stone chimney and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A little creek, more of an energetic stream, really, burbled along about 50 feet behind it. The sound was constant, a white noise machine provided by nature. It was idyllic. The first day and a half were just perfect. We unpacked the groceries. I figured out the temperamental wood-burning stove that was our only source of heat and our kitchen, and we just existed. We read books. The kids chased squirrels. My wife sketched the trees. We went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the creek, and the absolute, profound silence that settled over everything once the sun went down. The second night is when it all changed. I can still feel it, that shift in the air. We'd gone to bed, same as the night before. The kids were in their room, my wife and I in ours. The cabin was dark, just the faint orange glow from the stove's vents painting the walls. I was almost asleep, that floaty feeling just before you drop off, when I heard it. Thump. It wasn't a small sound. It was heavy, solid, like someone had dropped a full sack of concrete onto the porch. My eyes snapped open. I lay there not moving, listening so hard, my ears started to ring with the strain. The creek was there, a steady shushing sound. Then, thump. Again, closer to our bedroom window this time, my wife stirred beside me. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "I don't know," I said, my own voice a low rasp. "Maybe a branch fell." Even as I said it, I knew it was wrong. The sound was too localized, too deliberate. It wasn't the random crack of a dead limb. This was an impact. I slid out of bed, the wooden floor cold under my bare feet. The air in the room felt different now, charged. I crept to the window, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. I didn't turn on any lights. I just peered out through the gap in the curtains. The moon was bright, nearly full, casting a silvery, stark light that created deep black shadows between the trees. At first I saw nothing, just the familiar shapes of pines and firs. Then my eyes caught on something. A patch of darkness near the tree line, maybe 40 feet from the porch, that was too dense, too solid. It was shaped wrong. It was hunched, a massive lumpy silhouette that was wider and taller than any stump or rock I remembered being there. I stared, trying to make sense of it. My brain offered up logical things, a bear, a moose, even a weird shadow from the moon. But the shape, it was all wrong for an animal. It was too upright, even in its crouch, and then it moved. It didn't stand up quickly. It uncurled. It was a slow, powerful, deliberate motion, like a mountain deciding to rise, and it just kept going. Up and up and up. My breath hitched in my throat, stuck there. This thing was easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. The moonlight caught its fur, and it wasn't black like I'd have expected a bear's to be. It was a dark, rusty, reddish brown, like old, dried blood. It was just standing there, facing the cabin. I couldn't see its face, not clearly, just a darker shadow where its head was. But I could feel it looking. I could feel its attention focused on me, on the window, on the warm, living things inside this little wooden box. A cold dread, the kind I'd never felt before, poured down my spine. It wasn't just fear. It was a primal, gut-level understanding that I was looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist. This wasn't a bear. A bear has a shape you recognize. This was a man shape, but twisted, massive, and covered in that long, shaggy fur. "What is it?" my wife whispered from the bed. I couldn't answer. I just shook my head, my eyes locked on the thing outside. Then it took a step. It didn't walk like a man, not exactly. It had a lumbering, heavy gait, but it was fluid, powerful. It came towards the cabin, and the terror moment, the one that's burned into my memory, truly began. It didn't run. It just walked right up to the porch and slammed into the wall. Not a charge, not a run. It was like it just leaned its immense weight into it. The whole cabin shuddered. A picture frame fell off a shelf in the living room and clattered on the floor. My wife gasped. From the kids' room, I heard my son's voice, small and scared. "Dad? Stay in your room," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. "Don't come out." I backed away from the window, my mind racing yet feeling completely frozen. The rifle. I had a hunting rifle, a .30-06, locked in a hard case in the closet. I'd brought it as a precaution, thinking maybe I'd see a deer, never imagining I'd actually need it. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the right one into the lock. The whole time, the pounding continued. Boom, a pause. Boom. It was moving around the cabin, testing the walls. I got the case open and loaded the rifle, my fingers clumsy and cold. The familiar heavy weight of the wood stock and cold steel in my hands should have been a comfort. It wasn't. It felt pathetic, like bringing a pea shooter to a tank fight. I moved into the main living area, the rifle held tight but low. My wife had gotten up and was huddled by the doorway to our bedroom, her face pale in the gloom. The pounding stopped for a moment. The silence was somehow worse. It was a listening silence. We could hear the creak again, and now something else, a low, rhythmic sound. Huff, huff, huff. It was breathing, deep, resonant breaths, like a bellows, and a smell started to seep into the cabin. A thick, musky, wild odor like a wet dog that had been rolling in rotten leaves, and something else, something pungent and animal I can't describe. It filled my nose and my throat. Then came the splintering sound from the porch. I risked a glance through the front window. It was out there. I saw a huge dark arm, covered in that same rust-colored hair, swing down and smash the porch railing. The wood didn't just break, it exploded into splinters. The sheer, casual power of it made my knees feel weak. It moved along the porch, and then its head and shoulders filled the window next to the front door. I didn't get a clear look at its face. It was a dark, broad mass with a heavy brow ridge that shadowed everything beneath it. But I saw its eye. Just one, for a split second. It wasn't glowing red or anything like the stories. It was dark, deep set, and it held an intelligence that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the vacant stare of an animal. There was something in there, something that was looking in at us, assessing us. It raised one of its hands and pressed it flat against the glass. The window wasn't small, but its hand nearly covered the whole pane. The fingers were long, thick, and the palm was massive. I could see the dirt and grime caked into the lines of its skin, the coarse hair covering the back of its hand and fingers. It wasn't a paw, it was a hand. It pressed, and the glass pane, which was old and thick, creaked in protest. I raised the rifle, my finger sliding onto the trigger guard. I sighted on its chest, a huge, barrel-shaped target, but I didn't fire. What if the bullet didn't stop it? What if it just made it angrier? What if it had a way to get in? My kids were 20 feet away. I was frozen by the weight of that decision. It stayed there for what felt like an hour, just breathing, that hot, musky air fogging the glass around its hand. Then it pushed off and continued its circuit around the cabin. For hours, it just circled. We could hear its heavy, plodding footsteps on the gravel and pine needles outside. Sometimes it would stop, and we'd hear that deep, sniffing sound, like it was sampling our scent on the air. Sometimes it would give the wall another jarring thump, just to remind us it was there. We sat on the floor, my wife and I, our backs against the wall between the living room and the kids' room. I kept the rifle pointed at the door, but my arms were trembling from the strain and the adrenaline. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We just listened. Every sound from outside was a fresh jolt of terror. The creak of a branch became its hand on the roof. The rustle of leaves. Was it coming back to the window? My wife held onto my arm, her grip so tight, her nails were digging into my skin, but I barely felt it. My whole world had shrunk to this cabin. The smell, the breathing, and the footsteps. The night stretched on, an endless dark torture. The fear was a physical thing, a cold rock in my gut. I was so tired, my eyes gritty and dry, but there was no chance of sleep. Every muscle in my body was wound tight, ready for a fight I knew I couldn't win. I just prayed for dawn. I'd never wanted to see the sun so badly in my entire life. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the black outside the windows began to soften to a deep gray. The individual trees started to separate from the mass of the forest. The sounds of early morning birds started, hesitant at first, then growing in confidence, and the footsteps. They stopped. We listened, straining our ears. Nothing, just the birds and the creek. The smell began to fade. The heavy, oppressive presence that had surrounded us all night was just gone. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, the rifle still in my lap, waiting for it to be a trick. The room got brighter. Sunlight, weak and pale, started to filter through the windows. Finally, I forced myself to stand up, my joints popping and aching. I went to the front window, my heart still hammering. I looked out at the porch. The railing was destroyed, a mess of splintered wood. And in the soft, damp earth at the base of the porch steps, there were footprints. They were huge, I mean huge, longer than my forearm and wide. They had a distinct shape, like a human foot but broader with 5 toes. I could see the impression of the arch. I just stared at them, a cold certainty settling over me. We didn't discuss it. We didn't pack carefully. We threw everything, clothes, food, books still in suitcases and coolers, into the car. The kids were quiet, confused. My son asked if the bear was gone. I just nodded, unable to speak. My wife herded them into the car, her face a mask of controlled panic. I was the last one out. I stood on the ruined porch for a second, looking out at the peaceful, sun-dappled forest. It looked so innocent, but I could still smell that musk in my nose. I could still feel the vibration of its body slamming into the walls. I got in the car, locked the doors, and we sped down that dirt road, not slowing down until we hit pavement. And then we just kept going. We didn't stop for gas or food for over 100 miles. My wife and I have never talked about it in detail, not once. We just exchanged a look in the rear-view mirror as we drove away, and we both knew. We knew it wasn't a bear. We knew what it was. We just knew. And we made a silent vow, right then and there, that we would never, ever stay in a place that remote again. The kids still think it was a bear. Maybe it's better that way. But I know what I saw. I know what stood up in those trees. I know what pressed its hand against that glass. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I still think I can smell that musky, wild odor on the air, and I remember what it feels like to be prey. Story 5. So, I've been sitting on this for a while, and I don't really know how to start, but I need to get it out. I've never posted anything like this before, but after reading some of the stories here, I figured maybe someone would believe me. It happened about 2 months ago, and I still get this cold feeling in my stomach when I think about it. My friend and I were out on this little boating trip, just the two of us, on a creek out in the woods. It was one of those days where the weather just turns on you, rainy and windy as hell, the kind that makes you wonder why you even bothered leaving the house. We'd planned it for a while, though. My buddy had this old aluminum boat, the kind with a small outboard motor that sputters more than it runs. And we thought it'd be fun to spend a Saturday out on the water, maybe do some fishing or just get away from everything. The creek isn't far from where we live, maybe an hour's drive, and it's surrounded by thick woods on both sides. It's not a big river or anything, just a narrow, winding creek that cuts through the forest, with water that's usually murky and brown from all the rain and runoff. That day, it was even worse because of the weather. The rain had been coming down since morning, not a heavy downpour, but this steady, annoying drizzle that soaks you through in minutes. The wind was picking up too, making the trees sway and creak, and the water was choppy, with little whitecaps forming here and there. We launched the boat from a small dirt ramp around mid-morning. I remember because we'd stopped for coffee on the way, and I was already regretting not staying in. The air was cold and damp, and the sky was this uniform grey, like a blanket had been thrown over everything. My friend was in a better mood than me. He's always up for an adventure, no matter what. So he was joking around as we pushed the boat into the water. The motor took a few pulls to start, and when it did, it made this loud rattling noise that echoed off the trees. We didn't talk much once we got going. The wind and rain made it hard to hear, so we just kind of huddled in our rain jackets, me in the front and him steering from the back. The creek was maybe 30 feet wide at most points, with banks that rose up into steep, wooded hillsides. The trees were mostly pines and some leafless hardwoods, since it was late fall, and everything was dripping wet. The water was high from the rain, flowing faster than usual, and the boat rocked with every gust of wind. I remember the smell. It was all wet earth and decay, like rotting leaves and mud, with a hint of something else I couldn't place. Later, I'd realize it was part of what made the whole thing so creepy. But at the time, I just thought it was the weather. We'd been out for maybe an hour, just puttering along, not really going anywhere in particular. The plan was to follow the creek for a few miles, and then turn back before it got too dark. But with the rain and wind, it felt like time was dragging. My hands were numb from the cold, and I kept wiping rainwater off my face, trying to see ahead. The trees along the bank were so thick that it was hard to see more than a few yards into the woods, just a wall of dark green and brown, with shadows shifting in the wind. That's when I first saw something move. We were rounding a bend in the creek, and I was looking toward the left bank, where the hill rose up steeply. There was a break in the trees, a small clearing maybe 50 feet away, and I caught a glimpse of something dark standing there. At first I thought it was a bear. We get black bears around here sometimes, and they're not uncommon in the woods, but this looked bigger, and it was standing upright. I nudged my friend and pointed, but he was busy fighting with the motor, which had started to cough and sputter again. "What is it?" he yelled over the wind. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The rain was coming down harder now, stinging my eyes, and the figure was partially obscured by branches. It was just standing there, not moving, and it was tall, really tall. I'd say at least 7 or 8 feet, but it was hard to judge from the distance. Its body was bulky, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur, almost black against the grey backdrop of the forest. I remember thinking it must be a moose, because moose can stand on their hind legs sometimes. But this was different. It was too upright, too human-like in its posture, but way too big to be a person. My heart started to beat faster, and I felt this chill that had nothing to do with the rain. I kept staring, and that's when I realized it wasn't looking at us. It was just standing there, facing the woods, like it was listening to something. The wind howled and a branch snapped somewhere, but the creature didn't flinch. I could see its outline more clearly now. Broad shoulders, long arms hanging at its sides, and a head that seemed too small for its body. There was no distinct face, just a dark shape, but I got the sense it was aware of us. My friend finally got the motor running smoothly again and turned to see what I was pointing at. "Holy shit," he muttered, and I could hear the fear in his voice. He cut the engine, and suddenly the only sounds were the rain pattering on the water, the wind rustling the trees, and the distant rush of the creek. The boat drifted slowly, carried by the current, and we were getting closer to the bank. That's when the terror really hit me, because as we drifted nearer, I could see it wasn't a bear or a moose. Bears move on all fours most of the time, and when they stand, it's awkward and brief. This thing was solidly on 2 feet, balanced, like it was built for it. Its legs were thick and powerful, and it had this heaviness to it, like it weighed a ton. The fur wasn't smooth, it was shaggy and wet, clinging to its body in clumps, and it was black. Not just dark, but a deep, solid black that seemed to absorb the light, making it stand out even in the gloom. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My hands were shaking, and I gripped the side of the boat so hard my knuckles turned white. My friend was frozen too, just staring. We were maybe 30 feet away now, close enough that I could see details I wish I hadn't. The creature's arms were long, almost to its knees, and I could see muscles bunching under the fur. It didn't move, but I had this overwhelming feeling that it knew we were there. The air felt heavy, charged with something I can't describe, like the stillness before a storm, but worse. Then it turned its head slightly. Not all the way, just enough that I could see the profile. There were no eyes that I could make out, just shadows, but I felt like it was looking right at me. My stomach dropped, and I think I stopped breathing for a second. This wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I've spent my whole life in these woods hiking and camping, and I've never seen anything like it. Bears, deer, coyotes, they all have a certain way about them, a wildness that's familiar. This was different. It was intelligent, deliberate. My friend whispered, "What the hell is that?" His voice was tight, barely audible over the rain. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too busy trying to process what I was seeing. The creature took a step, and it was smooth, effortless, like it was walking on solid ground, even though the forest floor was probably muddy and uneven. It didn't make a sound, which was the weirdest part. With its size, I expected to hear crunching leaves or snapping twigs, but there was nothing. Just the rain and the wind. It started moving away from us, heading deeper into the woods. Its gait was steady, almost graceful, and it didn't look back. As it walked, it passed by a low-hanging branch, and without breaking stride, it swatted it aside with one of its massive hands. The branch was thick, maybe an inch or two in diameter, and it snapped like a twig. The sound was sharp, a loud crack that cut through the noise of the weather, and it made me jump. I felt a jolt of adrenaline, cold and sharp, spreading through my body. That swatting motion, it was so casual, like it was nothing. The branch didn't just bend, it broke clean off. And the creature didn't even slow down, it just kept walking, disappearing into the trees. Within seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the forest. The whole thing lasted maybe a minute, but it felt like an eternity. We sat there in the boat, drifting, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Neither of us spoke. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and my skin was clammy with sweat under my rain jacket. The cold seeped into my bones, but I didn't care. I just kept staring at the spot where it had been, half expecting it to come back. Finally, my friend started the motor again. His hands shaking so badly he fumbled with the pull cord. The engine roared to life, and he turned the boat around, heading back the way we came. We didn't say a word the whole way back. The rain kept falling, the wind kept blowing, but everything felt different. The woods, which had always been a place of peace for me, now felt menacing, like they were hiding something. When we got to the ramp, we hauled the boat out of the water as fast as we could, not even bothering to secure it properly. We just threw it on the trailer and got in the truck. The drive home was silent too. I kept replaying it in my head, the way it stood, the way it moved, that branch snapping. I've tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was a bear or a person in a costume, but it doesn't fit. Bears don't walk like that, and no person is that big or that strong. The sheer size of it, the way it didn't make a sound, the feeling of dread it left behind, it's all stuck with me. I've gone back to that creek once since then, on a sunny day, and everything looked normal. But I didn't stay long. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees. My friend doesn't like to talk about it. He just changes the subject whenever I bring it up, but I know he feels it too. That thing, whatever it was, felt ancient and out of place, like it didn't belong in this world. And that's the part that haunts me the most. The way it didn't look back, like we were nothing to it, just a momentary distraction. I've spent nights lying awake, wondering what it was doing there, if it's still out there, and what would have happened if we'd gotten closer. But I'll never know. All I have is the memory, and this cold, sinking feeling that won't go away. Story 6. Okay, so this happened to my wife and me about 3 years ago. I've never written this down before, and honestly, I still get a tightness in my chest just thinking about it. We'd driven out from Vancouver for a long weekend, desperate for some quiet. Life in the city had been this constant grind of noise and deadlines, and we just needed to unplug. We'd heard about this remote lake in British Columbia, the kind of place you only find on topographic maps or from a friend of a friend who swears they've been there. The drive felt longer than it was, the paved roads eventually giving way to gravel, then to a dirt track that was more of a suggestion than a road, winding deep into the coastal rainforest. We finally found the spot late in the afternoon. The lake was perfect, a sheet of dark, still water surrounded by these huge ancient cedars and firs. The air was so clean it almost hurt to breathe. It was dead silent, the kind of quiet that feels heavy. We were the only people for miles, which was exactly what we wanted. We high-fived, feeling like we'd won the lottery. We got the tent up on a flat, soft patch of pine needles near the water's edge, set up our little camp chair, and just soaked it in. I remember the sun starting to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in these deep oranges and purples. It was peaceful in a way that's hard to describe. It felt like we'd found a little piece of the world that was just for us. We made a fire as it got dark, cooked some sausages on sticks, and just talked about nothing important. The firelight danced on my wife's face, and she was smiling, really smiling, in a way I hadn't seen in months. The forest at night was different, though. The silence got filled in with little sounds. The pop of the fire, the distant call of a loon out on the lake, the rustle of what you assume are squirrels or mice in the undergrowth. Normal stuff. We finished our food, doused the fire thoroughly with lake water until it was a soggy, hissing mess, and crawled into our tent. We zipped the door shut, feeling cozy and secure in our little nylon bubble. We fell asleep pretty quickly, lulled by the clean air and the exhaustion from the drive. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was the dead of night, pitch black inside the tent. Something had jolted me awake, not a sound, but the lack of one. All those little night noises had just stopped. It was that heavy, absolute silence again, but now it felt wrong, oppressive. I was just lying there, listening to my own heartbeat, when I heard it. Thump! It was a solid, dense sound against the side of the tent. The nylon wall vibrated slightly. My wife stirred next to me. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "Probably a pine cone," I whispered back, trying to sound calm. Wind knocked it loose, but there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. Then another one hit. Thwack! This one was from a different direction, hitting the other side of the tent. It was sharper, harder. My wife's hand found mine in the dark and squeezed. We both lay perfectly still, not breathing. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a waiting silence. It felt like whatever was out there was waiting for us to react. Thump, thwack. Two more in quick succession from two different angles. One hit the roof. This wasn't random. Pine cones don't fall in a pattern. They don't take turns hitting different sides of a tent. This was deliberate. It felt like provocation, like someone or something was testing us, seeing what we would do. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. My wife was trembling, her breathing shallow and fast. "I have to look." I breathed into her ear, my voice barely audible. "No," she begged, her voice cracking. "Please don't." But I had to. The not knowing was worse than knowing. I slowly, painfully slowly, unzipped the inner mesh door of the tent just a few inches. The cold night air rushed in. I pressed my face to the opening, peering out into the darkness. The moon was out, casting a weak, silvery light that made the trees look like black paper cutouts. I scanned the area right in front of the tent. Nothing, just the shadowy shapes of trees and bushes. I looked left, then right. Nothing moved. The forest was a frozen tableau. I felt a stupid, fleeting sense of relief. Maybe it was just the wind. Maybe we were just spooking ourselves. The moment that thought formed, another pine cone slammed into the tent right next to my head. The impact was so violent it rippled the nylon and made the whole tent pole shudder. I jerked back from the opening, my heart leaping into my throat. And that's when we heard it, not the pine cone, but what came after. From the tree line, maybe 30, 40 feet away, a series of loud, deliberate cracks, branches snapping, not the small, random snaps of a foraging animal. These were thick, substantial branches, being broken with purpose. Crack, crunch, crack. It was moving, parallel to the tent, just inside the tree line. Something big. Something very, very big. I fumbled for the zipper, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grasp the little plastic tab. I got the mesh closed, then the outer rainfly, plunging us back into utter blackness. We sat huddled together in the middle of the tent, our backs to each other, staring at the walls as if we could see through them. We didn't speak, we just listened. The branch snapping stopped. The pine cone throwing stopped. The silence returned, heavier than ever, but the feeling of being watched was so intense it was a physical pressure. It was like a weight on my skin, a pricking at the back of my neck. I could feel eyes on us, not curious eyes, menacing eyes, calculating eyes. Whatever was out there knew we were in here. It knew we were scared, and it was enjoying it. My wife started whispering, her voice a terrified, broken stream. "What is it? Oh God, what is it? Is it a bear? It's a bear, right? It has to be a bear." But she didn't believe it, and I didn't believe it. We've been around bears. They rummage through coolers. They don't play games. They don't surround your tent and throw things at you from different sides. They don't move through the woods with that kind of intelligence. We sat like that for what felt like an hour, just frozen, listening to the blood pounding in our ears. Every tiny sound, the rustle of our sleeping bags, the intake of a breath, sounded deafening. We were trying to be silent, to be small, to just disappear. I remember the cold sweat soaking through my shirt, the way my jaw ached from being clenched so tight. My wife had her face buried in my shoulder, and I could feel her whole body vibrating with fear. Then the sound started again, closer this time. A heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud on the ground. It wasn't a walk. It was a stomp, a slow, deliberate stomping, like something massive was shifting its weight from one foot to the other, just outside the tree line, right where we'd last heard the branches break. And then came a sound I will never, ever forget. It was a low, guttural rumble. It wasn't a growl, not like a dog or a bear. It was deeper, more resonant. It was a vibration we felt in our chests more than heard with our ears. It was a sound of pure, raw power, and it was laced with something that felt like a threat, a promise. That was the breaking point. The terror wasn't just fear anymore. It was a primal, all-consuming certainty that if we stayed in that tent, we were going to die. We weren't going to be mauled by an animal. We were going to be played with and then dismantled. "We have to go now," I whispered, my voice a dry croak. My wife just nodded, her eyes wide and wild in the sliver of moonlight coming through the mesh. We moved faster than I thought possible. There was no discussion, no plan. It was pure adrenalized instinct. We didn't bother with folding anything. We just grabbed our sleeping bags and mats and shoved them any which way into our packs. I remember my fingers fumbling with the tent poles, my breath catching in my throat every time the plastic clips made a clicking sound. I was sure that any noise we made was inviting it closer. The entire time we could hear it. The stomping had stopped, but we could hear it moving out there, a heavy footfall on dry needles. A low, wet-sounding sniffing noise, like it was scenting the air, scenting our fear. It was circling us. We were packing up our lives with a predator watching us from the dark, and we knew it. I got the tent down, a tangled mess of nylon and poles, and just crammed it, stakes and all, into the back of our SUV. We threw our packs in after it. My wife scrambled into the passenger seat and locked her door. The sound of the lock engaging was the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. I jumped into the driver's seat, my hands slick with sweat on the key fob. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life, and I've never been so relieved to hear anything in my life. I didn't turn on the headlights. I was too scared of what I might see illuminated in their beam, standing right in front of the car. I threw the car into reverse and stomped on the gas, the tires spinning on the loose dirt and pine needles. I didn't look back. I didn't check the mirrors. I just focused on the narrow track ahead of me, driving by the dim glow of the moon, swerving around potholes and overgrown roots. It wasn't until we were bouncing back down that dirt road, putting distance between us and that lake, that I finally flicked on the headlights. The twin beams cut through the darkness, showing nothing but trees and the road ahead. We didn't speak for the entire drive back to the main gravel road. There was nothing to say. What could we possibly have talked about? The weather? We just sat in silence, both of us shaking, wrapped in a blanket of shared terror. We drove all the way back to Vancouver that night. We didn't stop. We didn't even slow down. We just went home, unpacked the car in a daze in our driveway as the sun was coming up, and went inside. We never went camping again. We never even talked about what happened that night. Not the next day, not ever. It's like we made an unspoken pact to just bury it, but it's always there, just under the surface. I still can't walk into a quiet forest without that feeling of being watched creeping back in. I still jump at sudden noises, and sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up for no reason and just lie there listening, and I can still hear the sound of those pine cones hitting the tent and that deep, chest-rumbling growl from something that was far more than an animal, something that knew exactly what it was doing to us. We didn't just get scared, we got hunted, and I still don't know why it let us go. So story 7. It was one of those December days where the cold just gets into your bones and decides to stay there. The middle of the month, a Tuesday, I think. The year was 2020. We'd spent the whole afternoon up at our property near Silverton, just me, my partner, and our 2 friends, trying to fix a busted section of the waterline before the deep freeze set in for good. It was stupid cold, the kind that makes your nostrils stick together when you breathe in. We were all exhausted, covered in mud and frozen dirt, and the only thing on anyone's mind was getting home, cranking the heat, and maybe having a beer that didn't taste like it had been chilled in a snowbank. I was driving our old Ford pickup. My partner was in the passenger seat, and our 2 friends were squeezed in the back. It was maybe 4:30, but it felt like midnight. The sun was already gone, just this dull, purple bruise of light left in the sky over the mountains. The headlights cut 2 shaky tunnels through the falling snow, and beyond that, it was just blackness and the ghostly shapes of trees. We were on the main forestry road, the one that eventually winds its way down to town. We only had about 5 kilometers to go. I remember feeling the warmth finally starting to seep back into my fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about the leftover chili in the fridge. Everything was quiet, just the rumble of the engine and the thump, thump, thump of the tires over the packed snow. Then my partner, who'd been staring out the window, suddenly sat up straight. Their voice was low, but it cut through the quiet like a knife. "Whoa! Look, is that a bear?" I leaned forward, peering over the steering wheel, following where they were pointing. Up ahead, on the right-hand shoulder of the road, maybe 50 meters away, there was a shape, a big, dark shape, just standing there in the beam of my headlights. My first thought was, yeah, a bear, a big one. But it was December in British Columbia. Every bear with half a brain should have been curled up in a den somewhere, fat and happy and asleep. This one was just standing, and it was standing wrong. It was huge, way taller than any bear I'd ever seen. It was upright on 2 legs, and it was shaggy, not like a bear's fur, which can look shaggy, but like it was draped in something, like a wet, mangy hide. The head was blocky, and it seemed to be looking right down the road at us, right into the headlights. I must have slowed down without even thinking, because the truck was crawling now. We were getting closer, maybe 30 meters away. The thing was just a silhouette against the white snow, but the details were getting sharper. It was massive through the chest and shoulders. Then it moved. It didn't turn and amble off into the woods like a bear would. It didn't drop to all 4s with a smooth animal grace. This was different. It was like its legs just buckled. It collapsed down into a crouch. But it was an awkward, almost broken-looking motion. Its arms seemed too long, and they splayed out as it dropped, like it was catching itself. And then it was on all 4s, but it was still too high off the ground, its back end hunched up weirdly. From the back seat, one of our friends, the one who's a bit of a wildlife nut, whispered, "That's not a bear." The words hung in the air. Nobody argued. We all knew it. We all felt it. The air in the cab of the truck went thick and heavy. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm. The thing on the side of the road, now on all 4s, took one last look in our direction. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them. And then it lunged. It didn't run. It lunged sideways into the wall of trees. It was fast, unnaturally fast, and it just vanished. 1 second it was there, a hulking black shape in the snow, and the next there was nothing. Just the empty shoulder and the dark, silent forest. I didn't stop. I think I actually pressed the gas pedal harder. My hands were clenched so tight on the wheel my knuckles were white. Nobody spoke for a full minute. We just listened to the truck's engine and the sound of our own breathing. "What the hell was that?" my partner finally said, their voice shaky. Our friend in the back, the wildlife guy, was adamant. That was not a bear. Bears don't move like that. They don't stand that straight, and they're all hibernating right now. That was something else. The rest of the drive home was tense and quiet. The cozy thought of chili and a warm house was gone, replaced by a low, humming dread. We kept staring out the windows into the dark spaces between the trees, half expecting to see that shape again, keeping pace with us. We pulled into our driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and the second I killed the engine, the silence felt oppressive. We got inside, turned on all the lights, and just stood in the kitchen for a minute looking at each other. Nobody wanted to say it, but we were all thinking the same thing. We had to go back. It sounds crazy now, typing it out. Why would we go back? But in the moment it felt necessary. It was like we had to prove to ourselves that we hadn't all just shared the same hallucination. We had to see if there was any evidence. Flashlights, I said, and my phone. We'll just go look. We don't even have to get out of the truck. My partner nodded, their face pale. Our friends looked scared but determined. We grabbed 2 big mag lights and my phone. I made sure it was fully charged. We piled back into the truck, the interior still holding a bit of warmth from the previous trip. This time, the drive felt completely different. The 5 kilometers felt like 50. Every shadow was a threat. Every clump of snow-laden bushes looked like a crouching figure. When we got to the spot, I slowed the truck to a crawl. I could feel my stomach twisting into knots. This was it, the exact place. I pulled over onto the shoulder, maybe 20 meters past where we'd seen it. The headlights illuminated the empty road ahead. "Okay," I said, my voice sounding thin. "Let's be quick." We all got out. The cold hit me like a physical blow, sharp and immediate. The only sound was the ticking of the truck's engine as it cooled. We clicked on the flashlights. The beams were powerful, cutting bright white paths through the darkness, but they also made the shadows around us seem deeper, more alive. We walked back towards the spot, our boots making soft crunching sounds in the snow, and then we saw them. Tracks. They started right at the edge of the road, where the gravel met the deep snow of the forest floor. My partner pointed their flashlight beam at them, and we all just stared. They were huge. I mean monstrously huge. I've seen bear tracks my whole life. These were not bear tracks. They were footprints like a human's, but stretched and massive. They were pressed deep into the snow, which was about 8 inches deep there. Our wildlife friend knelt down first. "Holy shit," he whispered. I knelt down beside him, the cold of the snow immediately seeping through my jeans. I pulled off my right glove, a thick winter glove, and held it up next to one of the prints. My glove, from the heel of my palm to the tip of the fingers, didn't even cover the width of the ball of the foot. The print was that wide. The stride was what got me, though. The tracks led from the road into the trees, and the distance between each print was enormous. This thing hadn't been walking. It had been taking huge, loping strides, and between the prints, in the deep snow, there were faint, consistent drag marks, like something had been trailing behind it, brushing the snow. A tail? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I pulled my glove back on, my fingers already going numb. "Get the phone," I said to my partner. "Take pictures. Video. We need to get this." My partner fumbled with my phone, their hands shaking from the cold or the fear, probably both. The camera app lit up, and they started taking pictures, the flash going off and blinding us for a second each time. I took the phone and started a video, panning slowly from the road, over the tracks, and into the woods where they disappeared. "Okay, we're here," I said quietly into the phone's microphone, my breath pluming in the light. "These are the tracks. You can see the size. We saw something here maybe 20 minutes ago. It was standing right here." I panned the camera back to the road. It stood up, then it dropped down and went into the trees right here. As I was filming, a feeling started to creep over me. It started at the base of my spine, a cold prickle that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was the feeling of being watched. We were all feeling it. We stopped talking. The only sound was the faint whir of the phone's camera. We stood there, 4 of us, in a small circle of light, surrounded by an ocean of dark, silent forest. And the forest didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full. It felt like it was holding its breath. I slowly panned the phone's camera towards the tree line, following the tracks. The flashlight beam danced over the trunks, the branches, the deep shadows between them, and then I saw it. Or I didn't see it, not clearly, but something moved. Deep in the trees, maybe 40, 50 feet in, a patch of darkness shifted. It was just a flicker of motion, something taller and broader than any tree trunk, blending perfectly into the shadows. It was there, and then it was gone behind a thick pine. My blood went cold. I stopped breathing. I kept the camera pointed in that direction, my arm frozen. "Do you see that?" I whispered, so low I could barely hear myself. My partner, standing next to me, gripped my arm. Their fingers were like ice. "I see it," they breathed. "There's something in there." We all saw it then. We could feel its presence. It was a heavy, tangible weight in the air. It was the feeling of eyes on you, dozens of eyes, but focused into one single, intelligent, predatory stare. It was watching us. It had been watching us the whole time. We were the ones investigating, but we were the ones being observed. The quiet was the worst part. The woods in winter are never completely silent. There's the creak of trees, the rustle of a branch, the distant call of an owl. This was a dead, absolute silence. It was as if every living thing for a mile around had frozen, terrified into muteness by whatever was standing in those trees with us. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, but my phone's clock later told me it was only about 20 minutes. 20 minutes of standing in the biting cold, our flashlights darting around, trying to pin down a shape that refused to be seen. We were too scared to move, too scared to speak above a whisper. We were trespassing, and we knew it. The cold was finally what drove us out. It was winning. My toes were numb. My face was a frozen mask. The fear was a coldness from the inside, and the winter was a coldness from the outside. And together, they were becoming unbearable. "We have to go," my partner finally said, their voice cracking. No one argued. We backed away from the tree line, not turning our backs on it, until the last possible second. We scrambled back into the truck, slamming the doors shut, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into drive, spinning the tires on the gravel before we shot forward down the road. We didn't speak on the way home. We just sat there, shivering, wrapped in a silence that was heavier than any noise. We had the pictures, we had the video, we had the memory of those impossible tracks, and the crushing feeling of a presence that didn't belong in this world. We got home, locked the door, and for a long time we just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the phone on the table between us. We hadn't just seen tracks. We hadn't just had a scare. We had encountered something that defied explanation, something that walked upright in the snow in the dead of winter, that moved with a broken, alien grace, and that watched us from the darkness with a quiet, ancient intelligence. We looked at the photos later. They're blurry, they're shaky. They show giant footprints in the snow and a dark, impenetrable wall of trees. They don't show the thing itself. They don't capture the feeling of its gaze. They don't explain the drag marks between the strides or the way it dropped to the ground like its joints were all wrong. I still have the photos. I still think about it every time I drive down that road, especially in the winter when the days are short and the shadows are long. I think about what was standing there watching us drive by. I think about what was waiting for us in the trees when we were stupid enough to go back, and I know, with a certainty that sits like a stone in my gut, that we weren't alone out there that night, and that the thing we saw doesn't have a name in any book I've ever read. It's just out there, and it knows we saw it. Story 8. Okay, I'll try my best to capture this. It's still hard to talk about, even after all this time. I'm just gonna type it out like it happened, the way I remember it. No fancy stuff, just what went down. We moved to Gunstock Acres in New Hampshire back in 2001. The place is quiet, woodsy, Our house sits right near a creek, and out the big living room window you're looking at nothing but trees. It's peaceful, or it was supposed to be. This one day, it was a dark summer night. I remember the air was thick and humid, no moon at all, just black. I was in the living room around maybe 11 at night. The TV was on low, some old movie, but I was mostly just staring out the window. I do that a lot. You see things out there in the dark sometimes. Usually it's nothing, a deer, a raccoon, your eyes playing tricks. But not that night. I saw it move between the trees first, a shift in the shadows, something taller than it should be. I leaned forward, squinting. My heart started doing this weird thump, 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 like it knew before I did. Then it stepped out into a slightly clearer patch near the creek bank. It was huge. I mean massive, 9 feet tall, easy, covered in long, dark brown hair, matted and shaggy. It was walking upright, on 2 legs, but not like a person. Its legs were longer, its arms swung heavy. The gait was powerful, like it owned the ground it walked on. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't the first time I'd seen it, but it never gets easier. Every time, it's like a jolt of electricity straight to my gut. I was just stuck there, on the edge of the couch, unable to look away. It passed by the window, moving from my left to right, heading downstream. It didn't look at the house, just kept walking, silent for something so big, the sheer size of it. It's hard to explain. You see a bear on its hind legs. It's impressive. But it's still a bear. This wasn't a bear. The proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the head set forward. It moved with a purpose I couldn't understand. I watched it disappear into the trees on the right. The woods swallowed it up. For a minute, everything was quiet again, just the hum of the fridge and the TV. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. My hands were shaking. I rubbed them on my jeans, feeling the rough denim, trying to ground myself. Then I thought, it's gone. It's gone for now, but it comes back. It always comes back. I got up, my legs feeling like jelly, and went to the window. I pressed my face close to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block out the living room light. Outside was just a wall of black. I couldn't see more than a few feet into the trees. I stood there for what felt like a long time, just staring into nothing. My neck was tense. I could feel every muscle pulled tight. The silence outside was absolute. No crickets, no owls. It was like the woods were holding their breath. And then I heard it, a grunt. It was low, guttural, coming from the direction it had gone. It wasn't loud, but it carried a deep, wet sound. Like something clearing its throat. My skin prickled all over, goosebumps up my arms, down my back. I backed away from the window slowly, not making a sound. I didn't want it to know I was here, even though the lights were on. And it had to know. It always knows. I went and turned off the lamp in the corner. The room got darker, lit only by the flickering blue of the TV. Now, when I looked at the window, it was a mirror. I could see my own pale reflection, wide-eyed, and the room behind me. That's when I saw the shadow. With the main light off, the outside security light, the one mounted under the eaves, casts a weak yellow glow onto the patch of grass right near the house. Not far into the woods, just the edge, and a shadow fell across that patch of grass, a long, massive shadow moving. It was back. It had come back, just like before. Minutes later, it was pacing. The shadow was distorted, stretched, but I could see the outline, the big, blocky head, the heavy shoulders. It walked past from right to left this time, retracing its steps. I couldn't see the creature itself, just its shadow thrown by the security light, but that was almost worse. My mind filled in the details, and they were terrifying. I stood frozen in the middle of the dark living room, watching this shadow monster walk past my window. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. Then my oldest son came down the stairs. He's a teenager, doesn't scare easy. He saw me standing there, statue still, and followed my gaze to the window. "Dad," he whispered. His voice was tight. The shadow was gone again. The patch of grass was empty. "It's here," I said, my voice a dry croak. He didn't ask what. He knew. He came and stood beside me, both of us staring at the black rectangle of the window. We couldn't see out anymore. Just our own scared faces. "I saw it once," he said, so quiet I almost didn't hear him. "Last summer, out by the woodpile." I looked at him. His face was serious in the TV light. "It had a face," he said, "hairy, but you could see skin underneath, lighter skin around its eyes and mouth. It looked at me just for a second. Then it was gone." He shivered, wrapping his arms around himself. It didn't feel right. It felt old, and it knew I was there. It knew. Hearing him say that out loud made it so much more real. This wasn't just my problem. This thing had looked at my kid. My stomach turned to ice. We stood there for another 10 minutes, not talking, just listening. The house creaked. The wind picked up a little, rustling the leaves. Normal sounds. But we were waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then we heard the footsteps. Not in the house, outside, heavy, solid thumps on the ground. Not the light, skittering steps of a deer. These were weighty. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Walking through the dry leaves and undergrowth. It was circling the house. Not close, but not far either. Just beyond the tree line. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. It was slow, deliberate. My son's hand found my arm, and he gripped it hard. His fingers were cold. I put my hand over his. We were both trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. It was a waiting silence, a listening silence. And then it screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It wasn't an animal scream I'd ever heard. It was this high, piercing shriek that tore through the night, raw and furious. It sounded like it came from every direction at once. It felt like it was inside my head. The windows vibrated with the force of it. My son flinched so hard he almost fell over. I grabbed him, pulling him close. We both ducked, instinctively, as if that sound could physically hurt us. My ears were ringing. The scream seemed to hang in the air for a long time, echoing in the hollows of my skull before it finally faded. After it faded, the only sound was our ragged breathing. "What the hell was that?" my son gasped, his face white as a sheet. I just shook my head. I had no words. We waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. No more footsteps. No more screams. The normal night sounds didn't return. It was a dead, hollow quiet. "We should check," I finally said, my voice shaky. "The doors, the windows." He nodded, not letting go of my arm. We moved through the house together, a pathetic little parade of fear. We checked the front door lock, the back door, the basement door. All the windows on the first floor were latched. Everything was secure. It felt pointless. If that thing wanted in, a lock on a door wasn't going to stop it. We ended up back in the living room, sitting on the couch in the dark, facing the window. We didn't turn the TV back on. We just sat and watched the night. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, grey light was filtering through the window. Dawn. My neck was stiff, and my son was asleep, slumped against my shoulder. The fear from the night was still there, a cold stone in my belly, but the daylight made it feel distant, like a bad dream. I carefully got up, letting my son lie down on the couch. I went to the window and looked out. The world was wet with dew, the grass was green, the trees were just trees. It looked peaceful, normal. I unlocked the back door and stepped outside. The air was cool and clean. Birds were chirping. I took a few steps onto the lawn, my sneakers getting soaked. I walked towards the tree line, to the spot near the creek where I'd first seen it the night before. My heart was starting to pick up its pace again. This was stupid. What was I doing? I saw them then, in a patch of soft, muddy earth right at the edge of the woods. Footprints. They were enormous, longer than my forearm and twice as wide. 5 toes, clear as day, pressed deep into the mud. The stride between them was huge, impossible for a man. I knelt down, my knees sinking into the wet ground. I reached out a hand, but didn't touch. I just looked. The detail was shocking. I could see the lines in the skin, the pressure points where the weight had settled. They were fresh from last night, and as I watched, the one closest to the creek began to change. A trickle of water from the bank seeped into the print, slowly filling the deep toe impressions. The edges softened, blurring. In a few minutes it would be gone, just a muddy patch, like it was never there. I stood up, my clothes damp, my hands cold. I looked from the disappearing prints back to my house, to the window where I'd stood, and watched it all happen. It was real, it is real. It walks out there in the dark, and it knows we're here. It has never tried to get in, it's never threatened us directly, but the message is clear. This is its place too. We're just living in it. We don't go out at night anymore, not ever. And every time I look out that window after dark, my heart is in my throat. I'm always waiting, waiting for the shadow to pass by again, waiting to hear those footsteps. I don't know what it is. A bear doesn't walk like that. A moose doesn't have feet like that. It doesn't scream like that. It's just out there. And some nights it walks past my window, and I see it, and I still don't know what to do. Story 9. I'm Alexander Caulfield Anderson, and I need to get this out. It's been years, decades really, but some days it feels like it happened yesterday. I don't talk about it much because most folks would think I've lost my mind or they'd twist it into some tall tale. But it's real. I lived it, and I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, hearing those rocks crashing down around us. This was back in 1864 when I was an inspector for the Hudson's Bay Company. My job was to lead parties of fur traders through rough country, and that day we were deep in the Fraser River Canyon in British Columbia. It was supposed to be just another routine trek, but it turned into something I'll never forget. The morning started out like any other. We'd camped near the river the night before, and the air was cool and damp when I woke up. I remember the smell of pine and wet earth, the kind of scent that sticks in your nose. The men were already stirring, packing up their gear, bedrolls, rifles, the trade goods we were carrying. There were about 10 of us, all seasoned traders used to long journeys, but none of us were prepared for what came later. The sky was overcast, with grey clouds hanging low, and a fine mist clung to the trees. It made everything feel heavy, like the world was holding its breath. We didn't say much as we got ready, just the usual grunts and nods, the sound of boots crunching on gravel, and the soft rush of the river nearby. We set off along the trail that wound through the canyon. It was narrow in places, with steep cliffs rising on either side, covered in thick forest. The Fraser River was to our left, roaring and churning. Its noise was constant, a background hum that you got used to after a while. But that day it felt different. Maybe it was just my nerves, but I kept feeling like we were being watched. I'd glance up at the ridges, but I never saw anything out of the ordinary. Just trees and rock, the same as always. The men noticed it too. I could see it in their eyes. They'd pause sometimes, staring into the woods, then shake their heads and keep moving. No one said anything, though. You don't admit to being spooked on the trail. It's bad for morale. Around mid-morning, we stopped to rest near a bend in the river. The mist had lifted a bit, but the air was still thick with moisture. I remember sitting on a fallen log, taking a swig from my canteen. The water tasted metallic, like it always did from that river. One of the men, a younger fellow with a scraggly beard, pointed up at the cliffs and said he thought he saw movement. I looked, but there was nothing, just shadows shifting in the wind. I told him it was probably a deer or a bear, something common in these parts, but inside I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. It wasn't like him to jump at shadows. We moved on after that, following the trail as it climbed higher. The going was slow because the path was rocky and slippery in spots. I was leading the way, with the men strung out behind me. The sound of the river faded a little as we got farther from the bank, replaced by the crunch of our footsteps and the occasional call of a bird. But then the birds went quiet. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a predator was nearby, but the silence stretched on, and that's when the first rock came. It wasn't a small stone. It was a big one, about the size of my fist, and it slammed into the ground just a few feet in front of me. The impact sent dirt and pebbles flying. I froze for a second, my heart hammering in my chest. I thought it might have fallen naturally from the cliff above. But then another one hit, and another. They were coming from up high, from the tree line on the ridge. Not random falls, these were being thrown. Hard. I shouted for the men to take cover, but it was chaos. Rocks were raining down on us, big ones that could break bones. I heard a cry behind me. One of the traders took a hit to the shoulder. He stumbled, clutching his arm, and I saw the pain on his face. The rocks kept coming, thudding into the ground, smacking against trees. The noise was deafening, a series of cracks and thumps that echoed through the canyon. I ducked behind a large boulder, peering out to see where they were coming from. That's when I saw them. Or at least I saw shadows moving up on the ridge, big, hairy shapes, barely visible through the trees. They were huge, taller than any man I'd ever seen, and they moved with a speed that didn't seem possible. My blood ran cold. I'd heard stories from the indigenous folks about giants in the mountains, something they called Sasquatch, but I'd always brushed it off as superstition. Now, facing it, I felt a primal fear I'd never known. These things weren't just animals. They were intelligent, coordinated. The rocks weren't random. They were aimed, trying to drive us out or kill us. I could hear the men yelling, panicked shouts mixing with the sound of the assault. Another rock whizzed past my head, so close I felt the wind of it. I pressed myself against the boulder, my hands shaking. The ground was littered with stones now, some as big as melons. One hit a tree nearby, and the trunk splintered with a loud crack. I risked a look around the boulder. The men were scrambling for cover, some behind rocks, others diving into thickets. The injured guy was still out in the open, trying to crawl to safety. I shouted for someone to help him, but no one could move without being targeted. The rocks kept coming, a relentless bombardment. I saw one of the shapes on the ridge heave a massive rock with both hands. It flew through the air in an arc, landing with a crash that sent vibrations through the ground. The force was immense. Whatever these things were, they had strength beyond anything human. My mind was racing. We had rifles, but they were packed away, and even if we could get to them, what good would they do against something we couldn't properly see? The fear was paralyzing. I could feel sweat dripping down my back, my shirt sticking to my skin. The air was thick with dust from the impacts, and I coughed, my throat dry. I remember the taste of dirt and fear, metallic and sour. The men were yelling, but their voices were drowned out by the noise. One of them, an older trader named Joe, I never learned his full name, started firing his rifle blindly up at the ridge. The shots echoed, but they didn't stop the rocks. If anything, it seemed to enrage them. The bombardment intensified, rocks coming faster and harder. I knew we had to get out of there. Staying meant we'd all be injured or killed. I signaled to the men to retreat back the way we came, toward the river. It was our only chance. The cover was better there, with more trees and the river bank to hide behind. We started moving, keeping low, dodging rocks as best we could. It was like running through a hailstorm, but with stones that could crush skulls. I helped the injured man up. His arm was bleeding and he was pale with shock. We half dragged him along, his weight heavy against me. The rocks kept coming, thudding around us, kicking up dirt and debris. I felt one graze my leg, a sharp pain that made me stumble, but I kept going. The descent to the river was steep, and we slid and scrambled down the slope. My boots slipped on loose gravel, and I almost fell more than once. Behind us, I could hear the rocks still hitting, but they were farther away now. We must have been out of range, or maybe the giants had lost interest. When we reached the riverbank, we collapsed behind a thick stand of trees, panting and shaking. The men were a mess, covered in dirt, some bleeding, all of them wide-eyed with terror. No one spoke for a long moment. We just listened, but the rocks had stopped. The only sound was the river and our ragged breathing. I checked on the injured man. His shoulder was swollen and bruised, probably broken. We bandaged it as best we could with what we had, but he was in bad shape. The others had minor cuts and bruises, but the fear was the real injury. I looked back up at the ridge, but I couldn't see anything. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. It felt like those things were still up there, watching us. My heart was still pounding, and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I kept replaying it in my head. The shadows, the rocks, the sheer power behind them. It wasn't like any animal attack I'd ever seen. This was calculated, almost like a warning. We didn't wait long. As soon as we caught our breath, we started moving again, following the river downstream. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? Every noise made us jump. A twig snapping, a bird calling. The normal sounds of the forest now seemed threatening. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those hairy shapes following us, but we never saw them again. The rest of the day was a blur of hurried travel, pushing ourselves until we were exhausted. We didn't stop until well after dark, when we found a relatively open area away from the canyon. We built a small fire, but no one slept much. We just sat there, staring into the darkness, listening for any sign of them. That was the end of it. But it stayed with me all these years. I've never been able to explain what happened. Were they real? Were they some kind of animal or something else? I don't know. All I know is that day, in the Fraser River Canyon, we faced something that shouldn't exist, and we barely escaped with our lives. I still dream about it sometimes, the rocks raining down, and I wake up feeling that same cold fear. I've told this story a few times, but most people just nod and change the subject. Maybe writing it down will help, but I doubt it. Some things you just can't forget, no matter how hard you try. Story 10. Okay, so this is something I've kept to myself for a long time, but I think it's time I finally got it out there. I've been reading stories on here for a while, and some of them hit close to home, so I figured why not share mine. It happened back in June of 1994, on my family's farm. I was just a kid then, in my late teens, and we were in the thick of tobacco season. If you've ever worked on a farm, you know how it is. Long days, back-breaking work, and that constant hum of machinery in the background. But that day, something happened that changed everything for me, and I still get chills thinking about it. It was a typical June morning, warm, but not too hot, with that heavy, damp feeling in the air that comes from the dew still clinging to the grass. The sky was a pale blue, with a few wispy clouds hanging around, and the sun was just starting to climb higher, casting long shadows across the fields. We had a big field at the bottom of a hill, right where the power lines cut through. You know the kind, those tall metal towers with wires strung between them, buzzing faintly if you got close enough. Below that hill was where we were setting tobacco, which basically means we were transplanting the young plants from the seed beds into the rows in the field. It's tedious work, bending over for hours. But it's something we did every year. I was out there with a couple of other guys, family friends who helped out during busy seasons. We didn't use names much back then. It was just, "Hey you," or a nod, so I'll keep it that way. We had this old tractor, a John Deere, that rattled and roared like it was about to fall apart, but it got the job done. I was driving it that day, pulling a setter behind me that dug the holes and dropped the plants in. The noise was deafening, a constant grinding roar that made it hard to hear anything else. You get used to it after a while, but it always left my ears ringing by the end of the day. The field sloped gently down from the hill, and the power line cut ran along the top, kind of like a scar through the trees. It was an open area, maybe 50 yards wide, where they'd cleared the trees to make way for the lines. On either side, the woods were thick with oaks and pines, dark and shadowy even in the daylight. I remember glancing up there every now and then, just out of habit. It was one of those places that felt a little off, like something was always watching, but I never paid it much mind. We were focused on the work, trying to get as much done before the heat of the day really set in. Around mid-morning, maybe 10 o'clock or so, I was making a pass along the edge of the field, closest to the hill. The tractor was chugging along, and I was keeping an eye on the setter to make sure it wasn't clogging up with dirt. My hands were gritty from the soil, and I could feel the sweat starting to soak through my shirt. It was one of those moments where everything felt normal, routine. I'd done this 100 times before, but then something caught my eye up on the cut. At first I thought it was a bear. We had black bears around sometimes, though they usually stayed deeper in the woods. But this was different. It was big, way bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, and it was moving across the open area under the power lines. I slowed the tractor almost without thinking, my heart starting to pound in my chest. The noise should have scared anything off. That tractor was loud enough to wake the dead. But this thing didn't even seem to notice. It was tall. I mean really tall, like 8 feet or more, covered in hair that was a dark, brownish black color, kind of matted and long, like it had been through a rough winter. The way it moved was what got me. It wasn't loping or shuffling like a bear. It was smooth, efficient, almost graceful, with long strides that ate up the ground. Its arms swung naturally, and it held itself upright, just like a person, but bulkier, more powerful. I've seen the Patterson film a few times since then, and I swear it was exactly like that. The gait, the posture, everything. It was like watching something out of a nightmare, but it was right there in broad daylight. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The tractor was still rumbling, but it felt like the world had gone silent. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and quick, and my mouth went dry. I remember thinking, this can't be real. But it was. The creature never looked our way. It just kept moving, crossing from one side of the cut to the other, like it had somewhere to be and wasn't bothered by us or the noise. It didn't hurry or slow down. It just moved with this eerie purposefulness. The whole thing probably lasted only 10 or 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I could see the muscles in its legs and shoulders working under that thick hair. The sun hit it at an angle, highlighting the texture of the fur, which wasn't smooth like an animal's coat. It was shaggy, almost ragged in places. Its head was proportionate to its body, not overly large, but I couldn't make out any facial features from that distance. It was too far for details, maybe 100 yards away, but close enough to see the sheer size of it. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Was it a person in a suit? No, the way it moved was too fluid, too natural. And why would anyone be out here in the middle of nowhere, dressed like that? Then just like that, it reached the tree line on the other side and disappeared into the woods. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, swallowed up by the shadows. I sat there for what felt like minutes, just staring at the spot where it had been. The tractor was still running, vibrating under me, and the noise suddenly felt overwhelming. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out all over my body. I was shaking, my legs felt weak, and I had to force myself to take a deep breath. I looked around to see if the others had seen it. They were further down the field, one of them bent over adjusting the setter, the other taking a drink from a water jug. Neither of them seemed to have noticed anything. They were just going about their business, oblivious. I wanted to shout, to point, but the words stuck in my throat. What would I even say? Hey, I just saw Bigfoot. They'd think I'd lost it. So I didn't say anything. I just put the tractor back in gear and kept working, but my hands were trembling and I couldn't focus. Every few seconds, I'd glance up at the cut, half expecting to see it again. But there was nothing, just the empty space under the power lines with the wires humming softly in the breeze. The rest of the morning dragged on. The sun got higher and the heat became oppressive, but I barely noticed. My mind was stuck on what I'd seen. I kept replaying it in my head, over and over. The way it moved, the size of it, the fact that it didn't even look at us. Why didn't it look? Was it that used to people, or did it just not care? The more I thought about it, the more scared I got. This wasn't some distant legend. It was real, and it had been right there, in a place I'd been 1,000 times. We broke for lunch around noon, sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck in the shade of a big oak tree. The others were talking about the work, how many rows we had left, whether we'd finish by evening. I just picked at my sandwich, not really hungry. My stomach was in knots. I remember the smell of the soil and the tobacco plants mixed with the faint scent of diesel from the tractor. Normally, those smells were comforting, but that day they felt wrong, like the world had shifted and I was the only one who knew it. One of the guys noticed I was quiet and asked if I was feeling okay. I mumbled something about the heat, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. My hands were still shaking a little, and I kept glancing toward the hill. Finally, after we'd eaten and were getting ready to head back out, I couldn't hold it in anymore. I pulled the older guy aside, the one who'd been coming to the farm for years, someone I trusted. I said, "I saw something up on the cut this morning." My voice was shaky, and I had to force the words out. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "What kind of something?" I took a deep breath. It was big, like really big, and hairy. It walked across the open area and didn't even look at us. I described it as best I could. The height, the color, the way it moved. I didn't use the word Bigfoot at first. I just said creature or thing because it sounded less crazy. He didn't laugh or dismiss me. Instead, he got quiet and his face went serious. He stared off toward the hill for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe you." That caught me off guard. I expected skepticism, maybe a joke, but he was dead serious. Then he told me something I'll never forget. He said that when he was a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, he'd seen something similar not far from here. He was out fishing with his dad, and they saw a tall, hairy figure moving through the trees along a creek bed. His dad had brushed it off as a bear, but he always knew it wasn't. He said it moved just like what I described, and he'd never forgotten it. Hearing that was both a relief and terrifying. Relief because I wasn't alone. I wasn't going crazy. But terrifying because it meant this thing was real. And it had been around for years. We stood there for a few minutes, not saying much, just absorbing it. The sounds of the farm went on around us, birds chirping, the distant hum of insects, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But it all felt distant, like we were in a bubble. We went back to work after that, but the atmosphere had changed. Every noise from the woods made me jump, and I kept my eyes glued to the tree line. The rest of the day was a blur. We finished up as the sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows across the field. Packing up the equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like those woods had eyes, and they were fixed on me. Driving home that evening, the sky turned orange and purple, but I barely noticed the beauty. All I could think about was that creature, and the fact that it was out there, maybe still watching us. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone else. What would be the point? Most people would just laugh or say I was imagining things. But that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again. That tall, dark figure moving across the cut, silent and purposeful. The next few days, I went back to work, but I was always on edge. I never saw it again, and part of me is glad for that. But sometimes, when I'm out in the fields alone, I'll catch a movement in the corner of my eye or hear a branch snap, and my heart will leap into my throat. I'll never forget that day, and I'll never have an explanation for what I saw. It's just one of those things that happened, something that doesn't fit into the normal world, and it left me with a fear that's still there deep down, and to this day, I can't explain it. Story 11. That day started like any other Saturday in early fall. I woke up around 6 in the morning, the sky still kind of grey and soft, not fully light yet. I'd been looking forward to this all week, just me, my little John boat and Mercer Bayou. I've fished there since I was a kid, so I know the place like the back of my hand. Thornton Wells boat ramp is where I always put in. It's quiet. Not too many people around, which is how I like it. I packed my gear the night before. A couple rods, some live bait, a cooler with water and a sandwich, and my paddle since the boat doesn't have a motor. I like the silence of paddling, you know, lets you really soak in the surroundings. I got to the ramp around 7, and the air was cool but not cold, with that damp smell you get near water. Mud, wet leaves, a hint of fish. I launched the boat easy enough. The water was calm, barely a ripple. The bayou's not huge, maybe 50 yards across in some spots, with trees crowding the banks, mostly cypress and oak, their roots dipping into the water. Spanish moss hangs down like old curtains, and in the early light, it all looks kind of peaceful, almost haunted in a pretty way. But that day, it didn't stay peaceful for long. I started drift fishing, just letting the current take me along while I cast my line here and there. I was aiming for bass, or maybe some crappie, nothing fancy. The sun was climbing higher, and by 9 o'clock it was warming up nicely. I remember thinking how perfect it was, the water gurgling softly, birds chirping in the trees, the occasional plop of a fish jumping. I'd been out for a couple hours already, caught a few small ones, nothing to write home about. But I was relaxed. My mind was wandering, thinking about work, life, the usual stuff. Then, around 10 in the morning, I caught a whiff of something off. At first, I thought it was just decay. You get that near water sometimes, dead fish or rotting plants. But this was different. It was thick and heavy, like a mix of wet dog, garbage, and something else I can't even describe. Kind of metallic, almost like old blood, but sweeter, if that makes sense. It hit me in waves, and I wrinkled my nose, trying to ignore it. I figured maybe an animal had died nearby, or it was just the swamp doing its thing. I've smelled bad odors out here before, but this one clung to the air, making it hard to breathe deep. I remember spitting into the water, thinking it might clear my senses, but it didn't help. I kept fishing, but that smell stuck with me. It got stronger as I drifted closer to a bend in the bayou where the trees are denser and the bank slopes up into a thicket. My skin started to prickle, like when you feel someone watching you, but I brushed it off. I'm not a superstitious guy. I've spent countless days alone in the woods, so I told myself it was nothing. But my heart was beating a little faster, and I found myself glancing around more often, not just at the water for fish, but at the shoreline. Around 11, I decided to take a break and eat my sandwich. I was anchored in a spot where the channel widens a bit, the water calm and dark. As I munched on my turkey and cheese, I scanned the bank out of habit. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow or a fallen tree. But then it moved. My breath caught in my throat and I froze, my sandwich halfway to my mouth. There, about 30 yards away, standing between two big cypress trees, was this thing. It was tall, way taller than a man, and covered in dark, matted hair that looked almost black in the shaded light. It was on 2 legs, standing upright, and it was just watching me. Its arms hung down, long and muscular, and I could see the shape of its body. Broad shoulders, a thick chest. But it was the face that got me. I couldn't see details from that distance, but it had this intense, unwavering stare. Its eyes were dark, maybe black, and they seemed to lock onto mine. I felt a chill run down my spine, like ice water pouring over me. My first thought was, is that a bear? But bears don't stand like that, not for long, and this thing was too upright, too human-like in its posture. And the hair, it wasn't bear fur. It was shaggier, more tangled, like it had been through hell. The smell was overwhelming now, so strong I could taste it in the back of my throat. sour and foul. I dropped my sandwich into the boat, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the paddle. I didn't scream or anything. I was too terrified for that. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, I'd heard stories, but I'd never believed them. But there it was, real as the boat under me. It didn't make a sound, just stood there, motionless, staring. I felt like it was studying me, and the intensity of that gaze made my skin crawl. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, a loud, frantic drumbeat. Sweat broke out on my forehead, even though the air was cool. I knew I had to get away, fast. I fumbled for my paddle, my fingers slipping on the wet wood. I started paddling toward the middle of the bayou, my movements jerky and panicked. I didn't look back at first, I was too scared to, but after a few strokes, I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was still there, still watching. Its head tilted slightly, like it was curious, but there was nothing friendly about it. The hair on my arms stood up, and I paddled harder, my muscles straining. The middle of the channel felt safer, but not by much. The bayou is maybe 100 feet wide there, so I had some distance, but it didn't feel like enough. I stopped paddling and just floated, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I kept my eyes glued to the spot where I'd seen it, but the trees made it hard to see clearly. The sun was higher now, casting dappled light on the water, but the shadows on the bank seemed darker, more menacing. I sat there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. My whole body was trembling, and I had to grip the sides of the boat to steady myself. The smell was still there, though a bit fainter, like it was lingering in the air. I kept scanning the bank, expecting it to reappear, but nothing moved. The birds had gone quiet, which made it worse. The only sounds were the water lapping against the boat and my own heartbeat, which was still racing. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a bear or a trick of the light. But that stare, it was too real, too intelligent. It wasn't animal-like, it was calculating, like it knew what I was thinking. I felt exposed out in the open, but going back toward the bank was out of the question. My mind kept replaying the image, that tall, hairy figure, standing so still, its eyes fixed on me. I've never felt so small, so vulnerable. After a while, I realized I couldn't stay out there forever. I needed to get back to the ramp. My truck was parked there and I had to get home. But the thought of paddling back, of getting closer to where I'd seen it, made my stomach churn. I decided to wait a bit longer, hoping it would leave. The sun was past its peak, maybe around 2 in the afternoon, and the light was starting to soften. The bayou was still quiet, too quiet. No fish jumping, no birds, just an eerie silence. Finally, I gathered my courage and started paddling slowly toward the ramp. I stayed in the middle of the channel, keeping as much distance from the banks as possible. Every little sound made me jump, a twig snapping, a leaf rustling. My eyes darted everywhere, searching for movement. I half expected it to step out of the trees at any moment, but nothing happened. The ramp came into view, a simple concrete slope with my truck parked nearby. It looked so normal, so safe, but I couldn't shake the fear. When I reached the ramp, I didn't waste any time. I beached the boat, my hands still shaking as I tied it off. I grabbed my gear and threw it into the truck, not even bothering to organize it. I kept looking back at the bayou, half expecting to see that thing emerge, but the trees were still, the water calm. The smell was gone now, replaced by the familiar sense of gasoline and dust from the parking lot. I got in my truck, locked the doors, and just sat there for a minute, my heart still pounding. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, a comforting sound. I drove away fast, not looking back. The whole way home, my mind was racing. What was that thing? Why was it watching me? I've never gone back to Mercer Bayou since that day. I sold my boat a few months later, couldn't bring myself to use it again. Even now, 2 years later, I still get chills thinking about it. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night remembering that stare. I've tried to rationalize it, but I can't. It was real, and it was terrifying. I don't know what it was, but I'm convinced something unnatural is out there lurking in those woods, and that's it. That's my story. I still can't explain it, and I doubt I ever will. Story 12. It was a Friday, I think, because we didn't have school the next day, so our parents let us stay out later than usual. The sun had gone down hours ago, and the sky was this deep, dark blue with a few stars poking through. No moon that I remember, so it was pretty dark, but we knew these roads like the backs of our hands. My friend and I had been riding around since maybe 8 or 9 at night, just goofing off, talking about dumb kid stuff, comic books, school gossip, whatever. We were on this dirt road that cut through some woods, lined with old barbed wire fences that separated the fields from the trees. The air had that damp, earthy smell you get after a light rain, and the ground was a little muddy in spots, making our bike tires squelch now and then. We weren't far from home, maybe a mile or two, but out there it felt like the middle of nowhere. The only sounds were the crickets chirping and the occasional rustle of leaves from the woods. I remember feeling a little on edge, but not scared. Just that tingly feeling you get when you're doing something you're not supposed to. My friend was riding ahead of me, and I was trailing behind, enjoying the cool breeze on my face. We had these cheap flashlights strapped to our handlebars, but the beams were weak, barely cutting through the darkness beyond a few feet. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. To my left, on the other side of this barbed wire fence, something moved. It was whitish, like a pale grey or off-white, and it was tall, really tall. At first, I thought it was a horse, because we had farms around there, and sometimes animals got loose, but this thing moved so fast, it was like a blur. It darted from one side of the fence to the other, pushing through these thick branches like they were nothing. I mean, 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. But not before I saw how it shoved aside a bunch of low-hanging pine boughs. The branches snapped and rustled loud, like someone was forcing their way through in a hurry. My heart just dropped. I froze for a second, my hands gripping the handlebars so tight my knuckles hurt. I could feel this cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my breath caught in my throat. I remember my legs feeling weak like jelly, and I had to force myself to keep pedaling. Up ahead, my friend must have heard the noise too, because he slowed down and looked back at me. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. I could see the fear in his eyes even in the dim light. I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. "I don't know," I muttered, my voice coming out all raspy. Looked like a horse or something. But even as I said it, something felt off. Horses don't move that fast through dense woods, and they sure as hell don't push through branches like that. They'd get tangled or hurt. This thing had just plowed through like it was strong enough to not care. We both stopped our bikes, just standing there in the middle of the road, listening. The woods had gone quiet. No more crickets, no rustling, nothing. It was dead silent, and that made it even creepier. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, a loud thump, thump, thump that seemed to echo in the stillness. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on us, and I had this urge to get out of there fast. My friend must have felt the same, because he nodded toward home, and we started pedaling again, but slower now, like we were afraid to make noise. As we rode, I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see that whitish thing following us. But there was nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the trees against the sky. The barbed wire fence ran alongside the road for a while, and every time we passed a gap or a break in it, my eyes would dart toward it, searching for movement. My skin was crawling, like ants were marching up my arms, and I had this tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe normally. We didn't talk much after that, just focused on getting home. The ride felt longer than usual, every bump in the road making me jump. I remember the way the flashlight beam bounced around, casting weird shadows that looked like reaching hands. At one point, A dog barked in the distance, and I nearly fell off my bike from shock. My friend let out a nervous laugh, but it was hollow, like he was trying to cover up how scared he was. When we finally reached my house, we didn't even say goodbye properly. He just mumbled something about seeing me tomorrow and took off toward his place. I stood there for a minute, catching my breath, my whole body trembling. The porch light was on, casting a yellow glow, and I remember feeling a rush of relief mixed with dread. I didn't want to go inside and have to explain why I was so shaken up. What would I even say? That I saw a ghost horse or something? They'd think I was crazy. I went in quietly, hoping my parents were already asleep. But my mom was in the living room, watching TV. She looked up and asked if I had a good time, and I just nodded, forcing a smile. I couldn't bring myself to tell her what happened. Instead, I went straight to my room and lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. My mind kept replaying the sighting over and over. That swift, whitish movement, the way the branches parted like they were being shoved aside by something massive. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer or a cow or even a person playing a prank. But deer aren't that tall, and cows don't move that fast. And a person? No way. No human could push through that thicket without making a lot more noise or getting scratched up. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I started noticing little details I'd missed at first, like how the thing seemed to blend into the shadows once it moved, or how there was no sound of footsteps, just the rustling of branches. I remembered the height. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall, based on how it cleared the fence and the trees, and the color. It wasn't pure white, more like a dull, pale shade, almost grayish, like it was covered in dirt or something. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Sunlight was streaming through my window, and everything felt normal again. But that memory was stuck in my head like a splinter. I got up and went outside, half thinking I'd go back to the spot and look for clues, but I chickened out. Instead, I met up with my friend later, and we talked about it again. He said he hadn't seen much, just a blur, but he admitted he'd been scared too. We both agreed it wasn't a horse, not with how fast it moved and how it disappeared into the woods like that. Over the years, I've thought about it a lot, especially when I hear stories online about Bigfoot or other weird sightings. My family has a history of it too. My uncle once told me he saw something similar in the same area, a tall, shadowy figure moving through the trees at night. He never reported it, and neither did I, but now I wish I had. Maybe if others in Pickens County have seen something like it, we could piece it together. But back then, I was just a kid, and the fear was so raw, so immediate, that I pushed it aside. Even now, as I write this, my hands are a little shaky. I can still picture that moment vividly, the dark road, the quiet, and that sudden, swift movement that defied explanation. I don't know what it was, and I probably never will. But I know it wasn't normal, and it sure as hell wasn't a horse. Whatever it was, it left me with a fear of the woods at night that I've never quite shaken. And sometimes, when I'm driving down that same road, I'll glance over at that barbed wire fence and feel a cold knot in my stomach, wondering if it's still out there. Story 13. It's still hard for me to even type this out. My hands are shaking a little just thinking about it. I've never posted this anywhere before, but I feel like I have to tell someone, and I guess a bunch of strangers on the internet is safer than telling my neighbors. They'd either think I'm crazy or get scared themselves, and I don't want either. I live in the foothills of North Carolina. My family's land has been in our name for 3 generations. It's not a huge spread, but it's big enough that you can't see the road from the house. It's all woods, thick and deep, with a creek that cuts through the back third of the property. It's beautiful, honestly, or it was. Now it's just home. A home with a permanent guest that shows up every single year and scares the living hell out of us. This all started when I was a kid. But I didn't really get it then. My parents would talk in hushed voices after we'd gone to bed. I'd lie in my room and hear them downstairs, the TV off, just talking low and serious. Sometimes I'd hear it too. A scream. Not a human scream, not an animal scream I could recognize. It was this deep, guttural, echoing sound that seemed to come from the creek bed. It didn't sound like it was in pain. It sounded like it was announcing something, like a declaration. It would start around late June and go through September, like clockwork. Our dogs, a couple of brave coonhounds, would lose their minds. They'd bark and snarl and pace the porch, the hair on their backs standing straight up, but they never ever left the yard, not once. They'd run to the edge of the grass where it meets the tree line, bark like they were going to charge in, and then just stop. They'd whimper and back up. They knew something was in there that they didn't want any part of. As I got older, I started noticing things myself. I'd be out walking the fence line in the late afternoon, checking for breaks after a storm, and I'd get this feeling. It's a cliché, I know, the feeling of being watched, but this wasn't a vague paranoia. This was a physical sensation. The little hairs on my arms and the back of my neck would stand up. The woods would go quiet, not just a little quiet, but dead silent. No birds, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing. It was like someone had thrown a soundproof blanket over everything. I'd stop walking and just stand there, listening to my own heartbeat in my ears. I'd scan the trees, but I never saw anything. Not then. I'd just feel this weight, this presence. It felt heavy and old, and it felt like it was focused on me. And then, sure enough, that night, the screams would start. Sometimes it was just one, a long, drawn-out roar that seemed to shake the window panes in my room. Other times it was a sequence, a scream, then a pause long enough for you to think it's over, then another one from a slightly different direction. It was like it was moving out there, patrolling. I'd lie in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin like a little kid, and just listen. My heart would be pounding so hard I thought it would crack a rib. It's a sound you don't forget. It's low, but it has this piercing quality to it that goes right through you. It's not high-pitched like a coyote. It's lower, fuller, with this weird echo that makes it sound like it's coming from everywhere at once. For a long time, that's all it was. Feelings and sounds. Stuff you could almost convince yourself you were imagining. But then I started finding things. I remember it was a Tuesday mid-June. The air was thick and humid. I was out near the creek, maybe a quarter mile from the house, looking for a good spot to put a stand for deer season. I pushed through a thicket of young pines and saw it, a path, not a deer trail. Deer trails are low to the ground. This was different. The underbrush was pressed down, sure, but the cleared space was about 3 feet wide, and the telltale sign, the thing that made my blood run cold, were the branches. On either side of this path, the smaller branches of the trees and bushes were snapped off, but they weren't snapped at ground level. They were snapped at shoulder height, my shoulder height, and I'm 6 feet tall. Something big and tall had walked through here over and over again, and it had brushed these branches aside with its body, breaking them clean off. I stood there for a full minute, just staring at it. I reached out and touched one of the broken ends. It was fresh, the wood still pale and damp inside. This wasn't from last year. This was recent. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This was proof. Solid, physical proof that I wasn't crazy. There was something sharing this land with us. I didn't feel excited or like some big explorer. I felt sick. I turned around and walked back to the house, and I didn't look back. I could feel that weight again, that feeling of being watched the entire way home. After that, things changed. We started seeing the eyes. It was my dad who saw them first. He was out on the back porch having a smoke late one night. He came back in, his face pale. He didn't say anything to my mom, just gestured for me to follow him to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water with a hand that wasn't quite steady and said, "Son, don't go out after dark anymore." I asked him why. He just looked at me and said, "Eyes, red eyes, way up in the trees, just staring." We all started seeing them after that. You'd be looking out the kitchen window, washing dishes, and you'd catch a flicker of movement in the deep dark of the woods. You'd stop and focus, and there they were, two pinpricks of dull, red light. They weren't glowing like laser pointers, they were more like the reflection from an animal's eyes, but deeper red, and they were set way too far apart, and they were high up, too high for a bear on its hind legs. They'd just be there, unmoving, staring at the house. You could look away for a few seconds, look back, and they'd be gone. Or sometimes they'd just vanish while you were looking right at them. But the real terror, the moment that is burned into my brain forever, happened one evening last August. It was a Thursday, I remember, because I'd spent all day helping a friend fix his truck and I was tired and dirty. The sun was just starting to go down, that long golden hour where everything looks soft and peaceful. The light was slanted through the trees, casting long shadows. I had to check the back fence line because we'd had some strong winds and I thought I'd heard a tree branch come down. I told my mom I'd be right back and headed out. The air was still warm, but the woods were already getting dark. I was walking along the fence, kicking at loose stones, not really thinking about anything. I got to the spot near the big oak tree, where the brush is really thick. It's a tangle of blackberry bushes and young poplars. I was scanning the fence, looking for damage, when my eyes just drifted past the brush into the woods beyond. And I saw it. My breath caught in my throat. My whole body just locked up. There was a shape standing behind the brush. It was maybe 50 yards away, half hidden by the leaves and branches, but its outline was perfectly clear in the fading light. It was tall, so damn tall. Its head was above the lowest branches of the trees back there, which would put it at well over 7 feet, maybe 8. It was massively built, shoulders that were impossibly wide, just this hulking silhouette. It was covered in hair, dark brown or black, that looked matted and shaggy. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, facing me. I couldn't see its face clearly. It was too shadowed, but I could feel its gaze. It's hard to explain. It was like a physical pressure on my skin. This intense, focused attention. I felt like a mouse that had just been spotted by a hawk. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of concrete. I was frozen, just staring back at this thing. My mind was racing, trying to find some logical explanation. A bear? No. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. A person in a costume? Out here? Why? And no person is that big. This was something else. This was the source of the screams. This was the owner of those red eyes. This was what had been walking that path. I don't know how long we stood there like that. It could have been 5 seconds. It could have been a minute. Time just stopped. Then, some deep, primal part of my brain took over. I took a slow, shaky step backward, then another. I forced myself to turn around to start walking back towards the house. I didn't run. Everything I've ever read or heard said not to run. So I walked. I walked as fast as I could without breaking into a sprint. My back was tingling, my skin crawling with the certainty that it was coming after me. I couldn't help it. About halfway to the house, with the back porch light now a welcoming beacon in the deep twilight, I turned my head and looked over my shoulder. It was still there, in the exact same spot. But now, in the near-total darkness that had fallen, I saw them, 2 points of dull red light reflecting some distant bit of starlight, or maybe the porch light itself. Those eyes, just watching me go. I didn't run the rest of the way, but it was a close thing. I burst through the back door, slamming it shut and locking it, my chest heaving. My mum asked me what was wrong, and I just shook my head and said I thought I saw a big snake. I couldn't tell her. I didn't want to say it out loud, saying it would make it more real, and that's how it's been ever since. It comes back every summer, right on schedule. Late May, the feeling of being watched returns. By June, The screams start up again, rattling the windows, making the dogs whine and hide under the table. We see the red eyes in the tree line. It's a part of the rhythm of our year now, as regular as the fireflies or the summer storms. It's never approached the house. It's never been aggressive. It just is. It's a presence, a perpetual, unsettling presence on our own land. We've grown accustomed to it in a weird way. You learn to live with the fear, to do your outside chores before dusk, to keep the dogs inside at night, but you never really get used to it. Every scream still sends a fresh chill straight down my spine. I've thought about setting up trail cameras. A part of me wants that final, undeniable proof, a photo, a video. But a bigger part of me is terrified of what I might see. And another part, a part I don't fully understand, feels like it would be a violation. This thing, whatever it is, has lived here longer than we have. It hasn't hurt us. It just watches, and it screams into the night. Putting a camera on it feels like poking a bear, but this isn't a bear. It's something else entirely. So we have an understanding, I guess, a shaky, unspoken truce. We stay in our cleared space near the house, and it stays in its woods. We don't bother it, and it doesn't bother us, not directly anyway. But its presence is a constant, heavy reminder that we are not alone out here, that the woods are deep and old, and hold secrets we can't even begin to understand. And every summer, when the days get long and the air gets thick, I know it's back. I'll be mowing the lawn and feel that sudden silence fall over the woods, and I'll know it's watching. I'll stop the mower and stand there for a second listening to the silence, and I'll feel that old familiar dread settle in my gut. I'll look towards the tree line, but I never see anything during the day. Not anymore. I just know it's there. And I know that when the sun goes down, the screaming will start. Story 14. The car was an old sedan I'd had for years, reliable but nothing fancy. The engine hummed softly as I pulled out of my driveway, and the neighborhood was dead quiet. Everyone was asleep, lights off, like the whole world had checked out except for me. I drove for about 20 minutes before I hit the turnoff for the dirt road. It was exactly how I pictured it. Narrow, unpaved, with trees crowding in on both sides. The headlights cut through the dark, but just barely, illuminating a tunnel of dust and shadows. The air smelled like pine and dry earth, and I could hear the crunch of gravel under the tires, a steady rhythm that almost lulled me into a trance. I had the windows rolled down a crack, letting in the cool night air, and the radio was off. It was just me and the road. I wasn't speeding or anything. I kept it around 30 miles an hour, maybe less, because the road was rough in spots. Potholes and ruts made the car jolt every now and then, and I had to grip the wheel tighter to keep it steady. My mind was still racing with the stuff from earlier. Work stress, some family drama, the usual garbage. But out there it started to fade a little. The darkness felt heavy, like a blanket, and the further I went, the more isolated it got. No streetlights, no other cars, just the occasional glimpse of an animal's eyes reflecting in the headlights before they vanished back into the woods. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, in a lonely kind of way. I'd been driving for maybe 45 minutes when it happened. Out of nowhere, this massive shape darted across the road right in front of me. I mean, it was huge. Bigger than a deer, bigger than anything I'd ever seen on a road before. It moved so fast, just a blur of dark fur and muscle, and my heart leaped into my throat. I didn't even have time to think. My hands jerked the wheel to the left, and the car skidded on the loose dirt. Tires screeched, dust flew up everywhere, and for a second, I thought I was going to spin out or hit a tree. But I managed to straighten out, swerving just enough that I missed whatever it was by inches. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through me, my hands shaking so bad I could barely keep them on the wheel. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over to the side of the road, the car shuddering to a stop. I sat there for a minute, breathing hard, my chest tight. tight. My heart was pounding like a drum, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. No more engine hum, just the faint rustle of leaves in the wind and my own ragged breathing. I leaned back in the seat, trying to calm down. My knuckles were white where I'd been gripping the wheel, and I flexed my fingers, feeling the tension in my joints. I thought about getting out to check for damage, but something held me back. The woods felt too close, too dark. So I just sat there staring out the windshield at the road ahead, lit by the moon and the lingering dust from my skid. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, but deeper, more resonant. It came from outside, somewhere to my left. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the driver's side window. And that's when I saw it. This massive thing, this creature popped up right next to the glass. It happened so fast. 1 second there was nothing. The next, this face was there, filling the entire window. I'm not exaggerating. It was huge, with dark, matted fur that looked almost black in the dim light. But its eyes, they were what got me. They were this reddish-yellow color, like embers in a fire, and they glowed with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They were fixed right on me, unblinking, and I felt pinned, like I was under a microscope. Then I saw its teeth. They weren't like any animal teeth I'd ever seen. They were sharp, pointed, almost shark-like, and they seemed too big for its mouth. It had this thick, powerful jaw, and the teeth gleamed in the moonlight, looking wet and dangerous. The creature's face was pressed up against the glass, so close I could see the texture of its fur, the way it was coarse and tangled. It didn't make any more sounds, just stared, and I could feel its breath fogging up the window slightly. The smell hit me then, a mix of wet dog, earth, and something else, something rotten like old meat. It was overwhelming, and I felt my stomach churn. I was frozen solid. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even breathe. It was like every muscle in my body had locked up. My mind was screaming at me to do something, start the car, drive away, anything. But I was stuck just staring back into those horrible eyes. They seemed intelligent, not like an animal's, but something more, something that knew what it was looking at. Time stretched out, and it felt like minutes, but it was probably only a few seconds. My heart was hammering against my ribs, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back, cold and clammy. My hands were still on the wheel, trembling, and I remember how the vinyl felt rough under my fingertips. Then something snapped. I don't know if it was a survival instinct or just pure panic, but my body finally responded. My foot found the brake pedal, and my other hand fumbled for the key. The engine turned over with a cough, and the sound seemed to break the spell. The creature didn't move, just kept staring, but I didn't wait. I put the car in drive and pressed the gas, not too hard because I was afraid of spinning out again. I drove away slowly, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. For a second, I saw it still standing there, a hulking shadow in the road, those red-yellow eyes watching me go. Then it melted back into the trees, and I was alone again. I drove for what felt like forever, but it was probably only a couple of minutes. My hands were still shaking, and I had to keep wiping sweat from my forehead. I couldn't stop replaying that face in my mind. Those eyes, those teeth, it was burned into my brain. I was so focused on getting away that I almost didn't notice the lights up ahead. As I rounded a curve, I saw flashing red and blue lights, emergency vehicles. There were 2 police cars and an ambulance parked on the side of the road, and a few officers were standing around talking. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with confusion. What were they doing out here? I pulled over again, this time behind one of the police cars, and killed the engine. My legs felt like jelly as I got out, and I had to lean against the car door for support. One of the officers, a guy in his 40s with a tired look on his face, walked over to me. "You okay, son?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. I must have looked like hell, pale, shaking, covered in sweat. I nodded, but words wouldn't come out at first. I just stood there trying to catch my breath. Finally, I managed to stammer out what happened. I told him about the animal darting in front of me, swerving, pulling over, and then the thing at the window. I described it as best I could, the size, the fur, those eyes and teeth. I was rambling a bit, I think, because it all came out in a rush. The officer listened quietly, not interrupting, and when I finished, he nodded slowly. "You're not the first," he said. "We've had a few reports lately of something big in these woods. People seeing shadows, hearing noises, some even claiming they've seen a Sasquatch." My blood ran cold. Sasquatch, I'd heard the stories, of course, but I never believed them. Not really. But hearing it from a cop, out here in the middle of nowhere, made it feel real. He went on to explain that they thought it might be mating season or something, which made the creature more aggressive, more likely to come close to humans. He mentioned a couple of incidents where hikers had gone missing, or cars had been found abandoned with strange scratches on them. Nothing proven, but enough to make them keep an eye on the area. He told me I was lucky I got away when I did, and that I should avoid this road at night from now on. I just stood there, taking it all in. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was mixed with this eerie sense of validation. I wasn't crazy. Other people had seen it too. The officer asked if I needed medical attention, but I declined. I just wanted to go home. He gave me a card with a number to call if I remembered anything else, and I got back in my car. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see those red-yellow eyes again. But the road was empty. The rest of the drive home was a blur. I made it back to my place, just as the sun was starting to come up, but I didn't feel any safer. I kept the lights on all day, jumping at every little noise. I had a meeting later that morning, some work thing I'd been stressing about, and I went, but I was a mess. I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to that face at the window. My hands were still unsteady, and I had to excuse myself a couple of times to splash water on my face. People probably thought I was sick or something, but I didn't care. All I could think about was those eyes, that smell, the sheer size of the thing. Even now, weeks later, I haven't been able to shake it. I don't drive at night anymore, and I avoid back roads altogether. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I'll close my eyes and see it again, clear as day. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear or a trick of the light, but I know what I saw. That creature was real, and it was something beyond anything I've ever known. The officer's words echo in my head. "You're not the first." It's that thought that haunts me the most. Whatever it is, it's still out there, and I can't help but wonder who it's going to happen to next. Story 15. And that morning, I woke up around 4 in the dark, the way I always do during deer season. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones even before you step outside. I remember pulling on my layers, thermal underwear, a thick flannel shirt, and my old camouflage jacket that's seen better days. I grabbed my rifle, a .3006 I've had for years, and headed out to my pickup truck. The engine cranked slow in the frosty air, and I let it warm up while I sipped coffee from a thermos. The plan was simple. Get to my tree stand before first light, sit tight, and hopefully bag a decent buck. I drove down the gravel roads near the Checkamega National Forest, the headlights cutting through the pitch black. It's a route I've taken 100 times, past familiar fields and patches of woods. I parked my truck in my usual spot, a little pull-off that's hidden from the main road, and shouldered my gear. The hike in was about a mile through dense forest, and I used a small flashlight to guide my way. The ground was crunchy with fallen leaves and a light dusting of snow from the night before. I could hear my own breathing, steady at first, and the occasional rustle of some small animal in the underbrush. Nothing out of the ordinary. I reached my tree stand just as the sky started to lighten from black to a deep gray. It's a sturdy metal stand I bolted into a big oak tree years ago, set in a clearing where I've had good luck spotting deer. I climbed up, settled in, and laid my rifle across my lap. For the first hour or so, everything felt normal. The woods woke up slowly. Birds chirping, squirrels chattering, that kind of thing. I remember feeling pretty relaxed, just watching the mist rise off the ground as the sun came up. But then things started to shift. The silence got heavier, if that makes sense. It wasn't just quiet. It was like the woods had gone dead. The birds stopped singing and the squirrels vanished. I've been in enough stands to know when something's off, and I started feeling like I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off as hunting nerves. You know, when you're alone in the woods for hours, your mind can play tricks on you. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake the feeling, and scanned the trees with my binoculars. Nothing moved, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I had this gut feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 8:30 in the morning, I heard it. Heavy footsteps. Not the light, quick steps of a deer or a bear, but something bigger, slower and deliberate. It was coming from the thick brush to my left, maybe 50 yards away. I gripped my rifle tighter and peered into the shadows. The sound was deep, like whatever it was weighed a ton, and each step made a dull thud that echoed in the stillness. I could see branches shaking, something pushing through the undergrowth. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I remember thinking, this isn't right. I've seen moose out here, but this sounded different, more purposeful. Then I caught a glimpse of it, a massive shape moving through the trees. It was tall, way taller than any animal I've ever encountered, and covered in dark brown hair that looked almost black in the dim light. It wasn't walking on all fours. It was upright like a person, but huge. I froze, my finger hovering near the trigger, but I didn't raise my rifle. Something told me not to. The thing moved with a kind of grace that didn't match its size, and it stopped every few steps, like it was listening or scenting the air. I could smell it then, a musky odor like wet fur and rot, strong enough to make my nose wrinkle even from a distance. That's when my tree stand jolted. It wasn't a gentle shake. It was a violent lurch that made me grab onto the sides to keep from falling. I looked down, and my blood ran cold. The creature was right at the base of the tree, staring up at me. It had to be over 8 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the light. Its hands, I'll never forget those hands, were wrapped around the trunk, and they were enormous, like dinner plates, with thick fingers that dug into the bark. I could see the muscles in its arms flexing as it held on. Its face was what got me the most. Dark eyes, deep-set and intelligent, locked onto mine. There was no anger in them, just a kind of curiosity that felt wrong, unnatural. Then it opened its mouth and roared, not a growl or a snarl, but a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from its chest. It vibrated through the tree and into my bones, making my teeth chatter. I felt it in my own chest, like a drumbeat of pure terror. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, just staring back at it. The roar must have been a signal, because seconds later I heard another one answer from deeper in the woods. It was farther away, but just as loud. The creature at the base of the tree grunted in response, a series of low, rumbling sounds that didn't sound like any animal I know. They were communicating, coordinating. That's when the rocks started flying. Not little pebbles, but fist-sized stones that whizzed past my head or thudded against the tree trunk. One hit the stand with a metallic clang, and I ducked, covering my head with my arms. The creature shook the tree again, harder this time, and I heard the wood groaning under the strain. I was convinced it was going to pull the whole thing down. The smell got worse, overwhelming now. A mix of damp earth decay and that wet fur stench that made my stomach churn. I could taste it in the back of my throat, sour and thick. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my rifle. I thought about shooting, but what good would that do? If there were 2 of them, maybe more, I'd be dead before I could reload. So I stayed frozen, praying they'd lose interest. Every time a rock hit, I flinched, and the tree shaking made my seat sway dangerously. I remember gripping the metal bars until my knuckles turned white, and my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Time seemed to stretch out. What felt like hours was probably only minutes, but it was the longest moments of my life. Then As suddenly as it started, the rocking stopped. The creature let out one last grunt, looked at me for a long second and then turned and lumbered back into the woods. I could hear its footsteps fading, along with the other one moving away. The silence returned, but it was different now, heavy and charged, like the air after a storm. I stayed in that stand for what felt like forever, too scared to move. My legs were numb from sitting, and my whole body was trembling. When I finally worked up the nerve to look down, the clearing was empty, but the ground was torn up where it had been standing, with deep footprints in the mud. Climbing down was the hardest part. My hands were so slick with sweat I could barely hold onto the ladder, and every creak of the tree made me jump. I kept expecting it to come back, but nothing happened. When my feet hit the ground, I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my rifle and ran, not even bothering to pack up my gear properly. Branches slapped my face, and I stumbled a couple of times, but I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw everything in the back, jumped in, and peeled out of there without looking back. The whole drive home, my hands were shaking on the wheel, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. A few days later, I went back with a friend of mine, another hunter who's seen some strange things. We didn't talk much on the way. I just told him I needed to check something out. When we got to the clearing, the ground was disturbed, with torn branches and those huge footprints still visible in the soft earth. But it had snowed heavily overnight, and most of the evidence was buried under a fresh layer of white. We poked around for a bit, but there wasn't much to see. My friend just nodded and said, "Yeah, I believe you. I never reported it to the authorities." What would I say? Instead, I shared it with an outdoorsman's group I'm part of, and a couple of guys had similar stories from around the same area. That made me feel a little less crazy, but not much. What haunts me the most isn't the size or the sound. It's the intelligence in its eyes. It wasn't just some dumb animal. It knew what it was doing, and it was testing me. I've never gone back to that spot alone, and I doubt I ever will. Hunting used to be my escape, but now I'm always on edge, especially when I'm by myself. I feel small and helpless in a way I never did before, like the woods aren't mine anymore. That day in November 2009, something shifted, and I can't explain it, but I know it was real. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, hearing that roar, and I'm right back there, frozen in that tree stand, wondering what would have happened if I'd moved. Story 16. That morning, we left before the sun was even up, driving in his beat-up pickup truck with the heater blasting to fight off the chill. The woods we were heading to weren't some vast wilderness. It was a small, tucked-away area near the edge of town, mostly pine trees and oaks with a few trails carved out by local hunters over the years. Dad had been coming here since he was a kid, and he knew it like the back of his hand. As we pulled onto the dirt road leading in, the headlights cut through the darkness, and I could see the mist hanging low over the ground, making everything look hazy and almost dreamlike. We parked near an old gate that was half rusted shut, and I helped him unload our gear. 2 rifles, a backpack with snacks and water, and some basic first aid stuff just in case. The walk-in was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring after a while. We were on a narrow trail that wound through the trees, with thick layers of fallen leaves crunching under our boots. It was still dark, but the sky was starting to lighten up in the east, casting a soft grey glow through the branches. I remember the smell, damp earth, pine needles, and that faint, sweet scent of decay you only get in deep woods. Dad was walking ahead of me, his steps steady and sure, and I was trying to match his pace without making too much noise. He'd taught me how to move quietly, to listen for the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves that might mean game was nearby. My heart was pounding, not from fear yet, but from excitement and a little bit of nerves. This was my first real hunt, and I didn't want to mess it up. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when the sun finally broke over the horizon, flooding the woods with this golden light that made the dew on the leaves sparkle. We reached a small clearing, not much bigger than our backyard at home, where the trees thinned out and you could see a patch of sky overhead. Dad stopped and raised his hand, signaling for me to halt. He pointed toward the edge of the clearing, where the trail dipped back into the thicker woods. "See that?" he whispered, his voice low and calm, but I could hear the tension in it. I followed his gaze, squinting against the morning light, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a shadow or maybe a trick of the light, something my brain couldn't quite process, but then it moved, stepping out from behind a massive oak tree, like it had been waiting there all along. This thing was huge, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. I'd guess it was over 8 feet tall, maybe even more, because it made the trees around it look smaller. Its body was covered in dark brown hair, thick and matted, like it had been rolling in mud or something. But what got me were its hands and face. They were bare, almost human-like, but not quite. The skin there was dark, weathered, and it had this rough texture that made me think of old leather. It was walking upright, just like a person, but its arms were long, hanging down past its knees, and it had this broad, powerful build that made me feel small and fragile in comparison. It paused for a second, right there in the middle of the clearing, and turned its head slightly toward us. I couldn't see its eyes clearly from that distance, but I felt like it was looking right at me, like it knew we were there. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my fingers tightening around the rifle I was holding. I didn't even think to raise it or anything. I was just stuck watching this thing that shouldn't exist. It didn't make a sound, no grunt, no snap of branches, nothing. The woods around us were dead silent, like even the birds had stopped chirping. Then, in what felt like a heartbeat, it turned and slipped back into the trees, disappearing so fast that I almost wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. For what felt like forever, we just stood there, not moving, not speaking. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, and my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst out. My palms were sweaty, and I had to wipe them on my jeans to keep a grip on the rifle. I glanced over at Dad, and his face was pale, his eyes wide with something I'd never seen in him before. Not fear exactly, but this deep, unsettled awe. He slowly lowered his hand and shook his head like he was trying to clear it. "Did you see that?" he finally whispered, his voice shaky. I nodded, too scared to speak. My mouth felt dry, and I had to swallow a couple of times before I could get any words out. "What was it?" I managed to ask, my voice coming out as a croak. He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at the spot where the thing had vanished, like he expected it to come back. After a minute or two, he took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I don't know," he said, and that was the scariest part. My dad always had an answer for everything. He'd been in these woods his whole life, seen bears, coyotes, even a bobcat once, but he'd never seen anything like this. He told me later that he'd heard stories from other hunters about big, hairy creatures in the deep woods, but he'd always brushed them off as tall tales or drunk ramblings. Now, though, he wasn't so sure. We stayed there for what felt like 10 or 15 minutes, just listening. The woods had gone back to their normal sounds, the distant call of a crow, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. But it felt different, like the air was heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I kept expecting to hear footsteps or some sign that the thing was still nearby, but there was nothing. My legs were starting to ache from standing so still, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket now that the adrenaline was wearing off. I shivered, and Dad must have noticed because he put a hand on my shoulder. "We should keep moving," he said, but his voice was quiet, like he didn't want to disturb the silence. We didn't talk much after that. We continued along the trail, but the excitement of the hunt was gone, replaced by this tense, watchful feeling. Every shadow seemed to move. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I kept my rifle ready, but I didn't really know what I'd do if I saw that thing again. Shoot it Run! My mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer. What if it was still out there, watching us? What if it wasn't alone? I found myself scanning the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but everything was still. We walked for another couple of hours, but we didn't see any deer or much of anything else. It was like the woods had emptied out. Dad tried to act normal, pointing out tracks or bird calls, but his heart wasn't in it. I could tell he was just as spooked as I was. Around midday, we stopped to eat some sandwiches we'd packed, sitting on a fallen log near a small creek. The water was babbling softly, and for a little while, it felt almost peaceful. But then I'd remember that figure, the way it moved so smoothly, so silently, and my stomach would clench up all over again. I asked Dad if we should try to track it, to see if we could find any footprints or something. He shook his head right away. "No," he said, his tone firm. "We don't know what that was, and I'm not risking it. We're going home." I didn't argue. Part of me was relieved. The idea of following that thing into the deeper woods made my skin crawl. So we packed up our stuff and started heading back toward the truck. The walk felt longer on the way back, like the woods were stretching out, holding us in. Every time the wind picked up, I'd flinch, thinking I heard something behind us. When we finally reached the truck, the sun was high in the sky and the day had warmed up a bit. We loaded our gear in silence and Dad started the engine. The drive home was quiet too, both of us lost in our thoughts. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to make sense of it. The way it had stepped out, paused, turned its head, it all felt so deliberate, like it was aware of us, but didn't care. I wondered if it was just passing through, or if it lived there, in those woods we thought we knew so well. We got home in the early afternoon and Mom asked how the hunt went. Dad just shrugged and said, "Quiet day," and I didn't say anything either. How could I explain what we'd seen? It sounded crazy, even to me. Over the next few days we talked about it a little, but not much. Dad said we should keep it to ourselves, that people might not understand. I think he was worried they'd think we were making it up, or that we'd been drinking or something. So we never reported it or told anyone else, not even our closest friends, but I've never forgotten that day. Sometimes when I'm in the woods or even just walking down a quiet street, I'll get this feeling, like I'm being watched, and I'll remember that figure stepping out from behind the tree. I don't know what it was, a bear standing on its hind legs, some kind of animal I've never seen, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, and it changed the way I see the world. The woods aren't just a place for hunting or hiking anymore. They're full of mysteries, and sometimes those mysteries step out into the light, if only for a moment. And that's the thing that still gives me chills, not knowing, and maybe never knowing what we saw that day. Story 17. The air hit me first, that sharp, cold punch of late autumn in upstate New York. It wasn't quite freezing, but close enough that my breath plumed white the second I stepped outside. I remember standing there on the concrete steps that led up from our basement entrance, lighting my cigarette and taking that first drag. The silence was absolute. Not the dead quiet of suburbs, but the living, breathing silence of the woods at night. No cars, no people. Just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of nothing, really. That's what it's like out there. The world feels huge and empty. I was facing east, looking toward the neighbor's property about 140 yards away. They had an exterior light on, one of those motion sensor ones that cast these long, weird shadows. Their house sits at the edge of a clear-cut area, maybe 50 yards of stumps and scrub brush before the woods start up again proper. That's when I saw movement. At first I thought it was a deer. We get plenty of them, does with their fawns, big bucks during rutting season. But this was different. The shape was all wrong. It was tall, way too tall to be a deer standing up, and it was moving back and forth along the far tree line of that clear-cut area, north to south, then south to north, like it was pacing, not walking, pacing. There's a difference. When a deer moves, it's got purpose. It's going somewhere. This thing looked confused or restless, like I felt when I woke up. I froze with the cigarette halfway to my lips. My first thought wasn't Bigfoot or anything crazy like that. My first thought was that maybe one of the neighbors was out there, maybe sleepwalking or drunk or something, but the proportions were all wrong. This thing was easily 7 feet tall, but slim through the waist with these broad, squared-off shoulders. Its arms were way too long, hanging down past where a person's would. And the color, this cinnamon brown that almost seemed to glow in the dim light from the neighbor's house, the way it moved. That's what really got to me. There was no head bob, no up and down motion like when people or animals walk. It just glided, like it was on rails or something. Its legs were hidden by the terrain. There's a slight dip in the land right at the tree line, so I couldn't see its feet or how it was stepping, but the upper body stayed perfectly level as it moved, back and forth, back and forth. Not fast, not slow, just this steady, relentless pacing. I dropped my cigarette without thinking about it. The cherry hit the concrete step and scattered into tiny red sparks. My hand went to my pocket for another, but then I just left them there. Every hair on my arms was standing straight up, on my neck too, that feeling you get when you know something's wrong, but your brain hasn't caught up yet. That prickling, electric sensation all over your skin. I was in what my army training would call condition orange. Not quite fight or flight, but hyper-aware, every sense dialed up to 11. The thing kept pacing, north to south, maybe 15 yards each way, then turn and go back. It never hesitated at the turns, never broke rhythm. I tried to make out more details, but the distance and the lighting made it difficult. It was shaggy looking, like it had hair or fur all over, but not thick like a bear's coat. More like, think of a wet dog that's been out in the woods for too long, stringy, matted, and it was silent, completely silent. No footsteps, no breathing sounds, no rustling of leaves, just this ghostly back and forth movement. I remember thinking about time. How long had I been watching? My cigarette had burned out on the step, so maybe a couple minutes, 3 minutes tops. It felt like both an eternity and no time at all. My heart was thumping in my chest, but not racing. This heavy, deliberate beat that I could feel in my throat. I wasn't breathing right, shallow little sips of air because somehow taking a proper breath felt dangerous. Then I did something stupid. I glanced away, just for a second, down at my feet where the cigarette had fallen. I don't know why. Maybe to confirm I was still standing in the real world. Maybe just because the intensity of staring was becoming too much. When I looked back up, it was gone. Not walked away gone. Not disappeared into the trees gone. Just gone, like it had never been there at all. The space where it had been pacing was empty. The shadows weren't moving. The clear-cut area was just a patch of stumps and weeds again. That's when the real fear hit me. Not the alert fear I'd felt while watching it, but this cold, sinking dread in my gut. Because I realized something. If it had been there 1 second and gone the next, it must have moved fast, really fast, and the only cover nearby was this ravine that cuts through the properties east of us. It's not deep, maybe 6 feet at most, but it's overgrown with brush and trees. Perfect concealment, and that ravine runs right past where I was standing. It could be flanking me. That thought exploded in my head. Military training again. When you lose visual contact with a potential threat, assume it's maneuvering to attack from an unexpected direction. My back was suddenly intensely vulnerable. The basement door behind me seemed miles away. I didn't run. That much training stuck. Running can trigger pursuit behavior in predators. But I moved fast, backing up toward the door without turning around, keeping my eyes on the tree line. My hand fumbled behind me for the doorknob. I couldn't find it at first. And that moment of panic, just 2-3 seconds of grasping at smooth metal, felt like hours. Then my fingers closed around the cold brass, and I turned it, pushing the door open and stumbling backward into the basement. The warmth inside hit me like a physical wall. I stood there for a second, back against the closed door, breathing hard. The basement was dark, except for the faint glow from the digital clock on the cable box. 2 minutes past 3. Only 2 minutes since I'd gone outside? That couldn't be right. It felt like I'd been out there for half an hour. My wife was still asleep in our bedroom, the door slightly ajar. I remember looking at the thin strip of light from the street lamp filtering through the high basement windows and painting stripes across the floor. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My shoes by the door, the laundry basket overflowing, the faint smell of fabric softener. Normal things, everyday things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the world outside wasn't normal anymore. I went to the bedroom and shook my wife awake, gently at first, then more insistently when she just mumbled and rolled over. "What's wrong?" she finally asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I saw something outside." My own voice sounded strange, tight and higher than normal. She sat up, blinking. "A bear? Did you see a bear?" "No, not a bear." How to explain what I'd seen? There was something out by the miller's property, tall, walking back and forth. She got out of bed, pulling her robe on. Probably just a person. Maybe Jim's up early for hunting season. It wasn't a person. I followed her to the kitchen where she started making coffee. The familiar routine of scooping grounds and pouring water, somehow calming. It was too tall. The way it moved, it wasn't right. She gave me that look, half concern, half skepticism. The one she uses when I'm being irrational, but she's too tired to argue. How tall? 7 feet at least, maybe more. And its arms, I held my own arms out, demonstrating how long they were. They hung down past its knees, and it was covered in hair or fur or something. That got her attention. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me properly. "Are you serious?" "I'm completely serious." My hands were shaking. I shoved them in my pockets. It was pacing back and forth along the tree line for like 3 minutes. Then when I looked away for 1 second, it was just gone. We stood there in the kitchen as the coffee brewed, its gurgling the only sound. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something looking in. The basement windows are at ground level, so anyone or anything outside could easily peer inside if they wanted to. "Should we call someone?" she asked finally. "Call who? The police?" "Hey, I saw a tall, hairy thing in my neighbor's yard. They'd think I'm crazy." She didn't argue with that. Instead, she poured 2 cups of coffee and handed me one. The warmth felt good in my hands, grounding. We sat at the small kitchen table, not talking, just listening to the house creak and settle. Normal nighttime sounds that suddenly seemed ominous. After a while, I got up and checked all the doors and windows. We only have 2 exits. The main basement door I'd come through and the interior stairs that lead up to the main part of the house where our landlord lived. Both were locked. I pulled the curtains closed on all the windows, something we never usually did. My wife watched me, sipping her coffee. "You're really spooked, aren't you?" I nodded. There was no point denying it. The way it moved, it was like it was gliding, no up and down motion at all. Just this smooth, silent pacing, and when it disappeared, I trailed off, not sure how to explain the suddenness of it. We sat in silence for what felt like a long time. The digital clock on the microwave changed from 3:45 to 3:46. I kept replaying the scene in my head. The cinnamon brown figure, the unnatural movement, the sudden disappearance. Trying to make sense of it, trying to find some logical explanation that fit. "Could it have been a moose?" she asked eventually. "They're tall, and they can look kind of weird in bad light." I shook my head. Moose have distinct shapes, the hump on their shoulders, the long face. This was different. It was built like a person, just bigger, and the arms were all wrong. "What about a bear standing up?" "Bears don't stand and pace like that, and they bob when they walk. This thing didn't. It stayed perfectly level." We went through all the possibilities. A person in a costume, a trick of the light, Sleep deprivation, nothing fit, not really. Not. The more I thought about it, the more details came back to me. The way its shoulders moved, the length of its stride, the complete absence of sound. Around 4:30 we heard something outside, a faint cracking sound, like a branch breaking. We both froze, listening, nothing else. Just that one sound. It could have been anything, an animal, the wind, the house settling, but in that moment it felt significant. I went to the window and carefully pulled the curtain back just enough to peer out. The yard was empty. The neighbor's light was still on, casting the same pool of illumination across the clear-cut area. Nothing moved. The world was still and silent again. "See anything?" My wife whispered from behind me. "Nothing." I let the curtain fall back into place. Maybe it was nothing, but we both knew it wasn't nothing. That sound combined with what I'd seen earlier, it felt connected, like whatever was out there was still around. We ended up sitting in the living room until the sun started to come up. Neither of us could sleep. Every little noise made us jump. The refrigerator cycling on, the heat kicking in, even the sound of our own breathing sometimes. As the sky lightened from black to grey to pale blue, I finally worked up the courage to go back outside. My wife stood in the doorway watching me as I stepped out onto the concrete steps. The morning air was crisp and clean, smelling of damp leaves and wood smoke from someone's chimney, normal morning smells. I walked around the property, checking the ground for tracks. The grass was stiff with frost, and I couldn't see any obvious footprints. Near the ravine, the ground was softer, but all I found were deer tracks and what looked like raccoon prints. Nothing unusual, nothing that matched what I'd seen. The clear-cut area where the thing had been pacing looked different in daylight. Smaller, less menacing, just a patch of land waiting to grow back. I walked over to where I'd seen it, standing approximately where it had stood. Looking back toward my basement apartment, I realized how exposed I'd been standing on those steps, how easily it could have seen me. That's when I noticed something, a broken branch on a young maple tree at the edge of the clearing. It was about 7 feet off the ground, freshly snapped. The broken end was pale against the grey bark. I looked around and found another one nearby, same height, too high for a deer to reach, too deliberate to be random. I didn't touch them, just looked at them for a long time, trying to understand what could have made them. Then I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and didn't go out again until I absolutely had to for work, later that morning. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I was tired, jumpy, distracted. Every time I looked out a window, I half expected to see that cinnamon-brown figure pacing at the edge of the woods, but I never did. It's been years since that night, and I've never seen anything like it again. I've told a few people, close friends, my brother, and they've all had their theories. Most think it was a bear or a person or my imagination. But I know what I saw. I know how it moved, how it made me feel. That cold, primal fear that has nothing to do with rational thought. Sometimes when I'm outside at night having a smoke, I'll catch myself staring at that same tree line, watching for movement. And every once in a while, I'll hear a branch snap somewhere in the darkness, and I'll remember that gliding pace, those long arms, and the way it vanished when I looked away for just 1 second. I still don't know what it was. I don't use the B word much because it sounds ridiculous even to me, but I know it wasn't a bear, wasn't a moose, wasn't a person. It was something else, something that moved wrong, something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the woods are dark, I wonder if it's still out there, pacing, waiting, watching from the tree line. Story 18. So, here's what happened. I drove up to High Point State Park early that morning, around 7 o'clock. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for a while. Just me, my tent, and some peace and quiet by a small stream I'd read about online. Life had been hectic with work, and I needed to disconnect, you know? No phones, no emails, just the sound of water and birds. I packed light. A backpack with a two-person tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a basic first aid kit. Nothing fancy. The park was pretty empty when I got there, which I was happy about. I found a spot not too far from the parking area, close enough that I could bail if I needed to, but far enough to feel isolated. The stream was maybe 50 feet away, babbling softly, and the trees were thick around me, mostly pines and oaks, with that fresh, earthy smell after a bit of rain the night before. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground, taking my time to stake it down properly because the forecast said it might get windy. I remember feeling really calm, almost relieved, as I unrolled my sleeping bag and arranged my stuff inside. It was one of those clear, cool mornings where the sun filters through the leaves and everything feels possible. After I was settled, I made myself a simple breakfast, a granola bar and some trail mix, washed down with water from my bottle. I sat on a log near the stream, just listening and watching. For about an hour, it was perfect. Squirrels chattered, birds sang. It was like the forest was alive and welcoming. I thought, yeah, this is exactly what I needed. Then I decided to go for a walk. There was a trail that ran alongside the stream, not too rugged, just a narrow path worn down by hikers. I started off, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots. The trail curved away from the stream after a bit, dipping into denser woods. That's when things started to feel off. At first, I didn't think much of it, just the usual forest noises, but then I heard branches breaking, not like a small animal scurrying, but something bigger. It was to my left, maybe 20 or 30 feet into the trees, moving parallel to me. I stopped to listen, and it stopped too. I shrugged it off, thinking it was a deer or maybe a bear, though I hadn't seen any signs of bears around. I started walking again, and sure enough, the sound picked up again, keeping pace with me. My heart started beating a little faster. I'm not usually a jumpy person. I've camped alone before, and I know how to handle myself in the woods. But this felt different. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Every time I paused, the movement stopped. When I sped up, it sped up. I tried to peer through the trees, but the undergrowth was thick, and all I could see were shadows and leaves shaking. I remember the hair on my arms standing up, and that cold trickle of dread sliding down my spine. I told myself to stay calm, that it was probably just a curious animal, but my gut was screaming at me to get back to camp. After about 10 minutes of this, I'd had enough. I turned around and headed back, walking faster now, not quite running but close. The sound followed me all the way until I reached the clearing near my tent. Then it just stopped. I stood there for a minute, catching my breath, feeling stupid for getting spooked, but the silence felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath too. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. I sat by the stream again, skipping stones and trying to relax. The sun was higher now, warming things up, and the birds were back to singing. For a little while it worked. I even dozed off for a bit, leaning against a tree. But then, out of nowhere, this howl cut through the air. It wasn't like any animal I've ever heard, not a coyote, not a wolf, nothing. It was long and drawn out, starting low and rising to this piercing note that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It came from the woods on the opposite side of the stream, and the second it echoed, every bird in the area went silent. Just like that. No chirping, no nothing. The only sound was the stream and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I felt a shiver go right through me, from my scalp down to my toes. It was so loud and close, like whatever made it was right there watching me. I stood up, my legs feeling weak. I scanned the trees across the stream, but I couldn't see anything. The howl didn't repeat. It was just that one time, but the silence that followed was deafening. I remember my hands were trembling, and I had to clench them into fists to stop it. That's when I knew I wasn't alone, and whatever was out there wasn't just some ordinary animal. It felt intelligent, like it was communicating or testing me. As the day wore on, I stayed close to camp. I didn't venture out again. I busied myself with gathering firewood for the evening, stacking it up near where I planned to build my fire. My mind kept going back to that howl and the moving thing in the woods. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a moose or something, but I've heard moose before, and this was different. The way it stopped when I did, it was too coordinated. When dusk started to settle in, the light fading into this grayish blue, I built a fire. I made it bigger than usual, stacking the wood high so the flames would reach up and cast a wide circle of light. I thought maybe the light and heat would keep whatever it was away. I sat close to the fire, feeling the warmth on my face, but I couldn't relax. Every little sound made me jump. A leaf rustling, the pop of the fire. Then I heard the knocks. At first I thought it was just the fire or my imagination, but no. They were distant, coming from deep in the woods, maybe a couple 100 yards away. 2 or 3 sharp thuds, like something heavy hitting wood, then a pause, then 2 or 3 more. It wasn't rhythmic, like someone chopping trees. It was irregular, but purposeful. Thud-thud, pause, thud-thud-thud, pause. I've spent enough time in the woods to know what human activity sounds like, and this wasn't it. No one would be out there at dusk, knocking on trees like that. It was too methodical, too isolated. I sat there, frozen, listening. The knocks went on for what felt like half an hour, always at a distance, never getting closer, but never fading away either. My skin was crawling. I kept my eyes glued to the tree line, expecting to see something emerge, but nothing did. The fire crackled and the knocks echoed, and I felt this overwhelming sense of being watched. I remember my throat was dry and I had to force myself to drink some water. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but it was getting dark, and I didn't want to hike out in the night with whatever that was out there. So I stayed, telling myself I'd leave at first light. Night fell completely, and the temperature dropped. I zipped myself into my tent, leaving the fly open so I could see the fire. I didn't sleep. I just lay there in my sleeping bag, fully dressed, with my flashlight in hand. The knocks had stopped by then, and the forest was quiet again, but it was a tense, waiting kind of quiet. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by footsteps. Not light footsteps like a raccoon or deer. These were heavy, crunching steps, like something big walking through the undergrowth. They were behind my tent, in the trees. My heart leaped into my throat, and I lay perfectly still, barely breathing. The steps were slow and deliberate, getting closer. I could hear twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and this low, grinding sound like weight shifting on the ground. It stopped maybe 10 feet from my tent, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. I could feel the vibrations through the ground. I was frozen, my whole body rigid with fear. My mind was racing. What if it's a bear? But bears don't stop and stand there like that. This thing paused for what felt like minutes, just standing there. I could hear it breathing, a deep, rumbling sound that wasn't quite like any animal I've heard. It was so close that if I'd reached out, I might have touched the tent wall and felt it. I remember the cold sweat on my forehead, and my teeth were chattering, even though I wasn't cold. I kept thinking, if it wants to, it could tear through this tent in seconds. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, it started moving again. The footsteps retreated, slowly, heading back toward the stream. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore, but I didn't move. I stayed like that for hours, curled up in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. Every sound outside made me flinch, the wind, an owl, anything. I've never felt so vulnerable in my life. When the first hints of dawn came, a faint grey light filtering through the tent, I finally unzipped the door and peeked out. Everything was quiet and still, the fire long dead. I crawled out, my legs stiff and shaky, and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place at first. Then I walked over to the stream to wash my face, hoping the cold water would clear my head. That's when I saw them. Footprints, in the soft mud right by the water's edge, about 20 feet from my tent. They were huge, bigger than any human foot I've ever seen. I wear a size 10 shoe, and these were at least half again as long and wide, but what got me were the toe marks, clear, human-like toes, but too long and spread out. No claws, no animal pad, just these distinct impressions in the mud, like someone had walked barefoot, but no one with feet that size. They led from the trees behind my tent down to the stream, then disappeared into the water. My blood ran cold. I stood there, staring at them, my mind trying to process it. I've seen bear tracks, deer tracks, all kinds of animal signs, but nothing like this. They were fresh from last night. I could see where the mud was still damp and disturbed. That thing had been right here, watching me, and then it walked away toward the stream. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I packed up my tent and gear in record time. My hands trembling so bad, I could barely roll up the sleeping bag. I didn't care about folding things neatly. I just shoved everything into my backpack and hiked back to the car as fast as I could. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something following me, but the woods were silent. I drove straight home, didn't stop for anything. When I got back, I unpacked and just sat on my couch for a long time, trying to make sense of it. But I can't. Whatever it was intelligent. The way it moved with me, the howl, the knocks, the footsteps stopping and starting. It wasn't random. It felt like it was playing with me or warning me. I've never gone back to that park, and I don't think I ever will. Sometimes at night I still hear those footsteps in my dreams, and I wake up sweating. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm sure it was no ordinary animal. It was something else, something that shouldn't be there, and I have no explanation for any of it. Story 19. The summer of 1980 was one of those long, hot, sticky ones that seemed to stretch on forever. I was 15, and the world was just this big, boring place that existed between school years. My best friend, let's just call him my friend, because even now, saying his name feels like it might summon the memory back too clearly. He was the same age. We were inseparable that summer, mostly out of a shared, profound boredom. This particular night was a Friday. I'm sure of it because we'd spent the whole week planning this little excursion. We'd managed to swipe a six-pack of Schlitz from his older brother's stash in the garage, the cans sweating and cool in our backpack. The plan was simple, almost a ritual for kids like us back then. We were going to hike the old service trail that cut through the woods behind our neighborhood, find a good spot away from any houses, and just listen to his cheap portable radio, drink our beers, and feel like we were getting away with something under a bright full moon. The moon was the main event that night. It wasn't just full, it was immense. A huge, pale silver coin that washed all the color out of the world and left everything in shades of gray, black, and that weird, luminous white. You could read by that light. It was eerie and beautiful at the same time. We didn't need flashlights. The path was just this ribbon of pale dirt snaking between the dark pines and oaks. We walked for maybe 20 minutes, the only sounds our own sneakers crunching on gravel and the buzz of crickets. The air was thick with the smell of hot pine needles and damp earth. We were laughing, talking about nothing, probably about girls or music or how stupid our teachers were. We finally found a spot we liked, a little clearing right on the edge of a ravine. It was a good place because you could see down into the gully, which was all choked with ferns and shadow, but you also felt a little exposed, which was part of the thrill. I dropped the backpack on the ground with a thud, the clank of the cans a satisfying sound. My friend was fiddling with the radio, trying to get a clear station through the static. He found some classic rock, something by Boston, I think, and turned the volume down low so it was just a background hum. I was just about to unzip the bag, my fingers actually on the zipper pull, when my friend's hand clamped down on my forearm. His grip was so tight it hurt, his fingers digging into my skin like 5 little vices. I started to say, "What the hell?" but the words died in my throat when I saw his face. He was frozen, his eyes wide, and fixed on a point over my shoulder, down towards the ravine. All the color had drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and waxy in the moonlight. He wasn't breathing. I slowly, so slowly it felt like my neck was creaking, turned my head to follow his gaze, and I saw it. About 30 feet away, right where the clearing started to slope down into the ravine, there was a figure. It was hunched over, partially hidden by the trunk of a young, skinny pine tree. My first stupid thought was that it was one of the local guys, maybe Frank Miller or one of the Johnson brothers playing a prank on us, but the shape was all wrong. It was gripping the tree, and I don't mean just holding it. Its hands, if you could call them that, were wrapped around the trunk maybe 4 feet off the ground. The arms were incredibly long, way too long for its body, and just dangling. Its torso was long too, but its legs were short and seemed kind of bowed. It was covered in hair, a dark, shaggy coat. But here's the detail that I can still see when I close my eyes. In the brutal, unforgiving light of that full moon, the hair had a faint, sickly greenish tint to it. Not like a bright green, but a murky, mossy color, like something you'd see on a rotten log in a swamp. Its head was the worst part. It was too tall for its body, sort of conical, and it was turned directly towards us. I couldn't see any eyes, just dark pits. But I knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical blow to my chest, that it was watching us. It was completely, utterly motionless. Not a twitch, not a breath. It was like a statue, but a statue of something that shouldn't exist. The radio was still playing that tinny guitar riff. The sound felt obscene in that silence. My friend finally found his voice, but it was a strained, high-pitched whisper. "Hey, Frank, that you asshole?" No reaction. The thing didn't move a muscle. I tried next, my own voice cracking. "Johnson, we see you, man, not funny." Nothing. It just kept staring. The silence from it was heavier than any sound I'd ever heard. It was a predatory silence, a waiting silence. This is where we did the dumbest thing 2 15-year-old boys could possibly do. Instead of running, we took a step closer. I think our brains just couldn't process it. We needed to see it better, to prove to ourselves that it was a trick of the light, a shadow, a stump. We took one step, then another, moving in a slow, hesitant shuffle. The details got sharper, and that's when the real terror started to curdle in my gut. The proportions were just off, unnaturally off. The arms were so long that if it stood up straight, its knuckles would probably brush the ground. The head wasn't just tall, it was perched on a neck that seemed too thin. And the way it gripped that tree. Its fingers looked long and sinewy, almost like a man's, but twisted and covered in that same mossy fur. It was the size of a big man, maybe a little shorter, but built completely wrong. It looked powerful in a way that was all wrong, a coiled, wiry strength. We were maybe 25 feet away now. I could hear my own heart hammering in my ears, a frantic drumbeat against the quiet. I could smell it too. A smell hit me then, a wave of it carried on a slight breeze. It was a thick, heavy smell, like a wet dog that had been rolling in rotten leaves and something else, something musky and wild, like a zoo enclosure. It was a physical smell, one you could almost taste at the back of your throat. I looked at my friend. His mouth was hanging open, a tiny bit of drool glistening on his chin in the moonlight. He was trembling. I realized I was trembling too, a fine, constant shake that started in my legs and worked its way up through my whole body. The beer, the music, the summer night, it had all evaporated. There was only this thing, and us, and the vast, silent woods. Then my friend made a sound. It wasn't a word at first. It was a low, guttural gasp, like all the air had been punched out of him. His eyes, which had been fixed on the creature, snapped to me. The sheer, undiluted panic in them was more terrifying than the thing itself. It was a look that communicated pure animal fear. It bypassed my brain and went straight to my spine. He sucked in a ragged breath and screamed, "Run!" That one word broke the spell. It was like a starting pistol. We spun around at the same instant. I didn't even think about the backpack, the radio, the beers. I just ran. I ran like I'd never run before, and I've never run like that since. It was a blind, panicked sprint, fueled by pure adrenaline. The world narrowed to the pale path in front of me, and the sound of my friend's frantic footsteps right behind me. I didn't look back. I was too terrified to look back, but I could feel it. I had this overwhelming, skin-crawling sensation that it was right behind me, that those long arms were reaching out, that I was about to feel its grip on my shoulder. Every shadow was a hand reaching for me. Every rustle of leaves was its footstep. I expected hot breath on my neck at any second. My lungs were burning, my legs were on fire, but I didn't slow down. I could hear my friend sobbing and gasping as he ran, a horrible, ragged sound. We crashed through the undergrowth, not even staying on the path perfectly, just heading in the general direction of home. Branches whipped at my face and arms, leaving stinging welts, but I didn't feel them. The only thing that mattered was putting distance between us and that clearing. The lights from the first houses at the edge of the woods appeared like beacons. We burst out of the tree line, stumbling into someone's perfectly manicured backyard. The motion sensor light on their garage flicked on, flooding the lawn with a harsh yellow electric light. It felt alien after the moon's glow, but it was the most beautiful, safe thing I had ever seen. We didn't stop running until we were on my friend's porch, fumbling with the screen door, our bodies slamming into the wooden frame in our hurry to get inside. We fell into his kitchen, a heap of gasping, trembling limbs on the linoleum floor. We just lay there for what felt like an hour, trying to catch our breath, listening to the frantic beating of our own hearts. We didn't say a word, not one. What was there to say? We just looked at each other, our eyes still wide with a shared horror that was too big for words. His mom called from the living room. "You boys all right? You sound like a herd of elephants." We just mumbled something back. "Yeah, fine," our voices shaky and thin. We went up to his room and just sat on the floor, leaning against his bed, not talking, not sleeping, just staring into space until the sun started to come up, bleaching the night sky with its normal, safe, ordinary light. The next morning, after a few hours of fitful sleep, we met up in my backyard. The air was warm and normal. Birds were chirping. It felt like a different world. We stood there, awkward, not looking at each other. Finally, I said, "So, that thing." He nodded, his arms crossed tight over his chest. "Yeah." I started describing it haltingly. It was kinda hunched. Long arms. Really long arms, he cut in, his voice low. And its head was pointy. "Did you see the color?" I asked, almost whispering. In the moonlight, it looked greenish. His head snapped up and he looked at me, his eyes wide. "Yeah, I saw it. A greenish tint, like a moldy color." We went back and forth like that for a few minutes, piecing it together, confirming every horrible detail. The too long torso, the short legs, the way it gripped the tree, the absolute silence, the smell. It was all the same. We hadn't imagined it. We'd both seen the exact same impossible thing. We ended up calling it the green monkey, a stupid, childish name for something that was so profoundly not a monkey. It was our way of trying to put it in a box, to categorize it and make it less terrifying. It didn't work. As we got older, we drifted apart like people do. But a few years later, when we were in our early 20s, I brought it up again. We were home from college for Thanksgiving, and we ran into each other at the grocery store. We made small talk, and then I said, "You ever think about that night with the green monkey?" His face closed off immediately. It was like a shutter slamming down. All the friendliness drained away. "No," he said, his voice flat and final. "I don't think about that. And you shouldn't either." He turned and walked away, and that was the last time we ever really spoke. I still live in the same town. My house isn't far from those woods. Sometimes on summer nights when the moon is full, I'll find myself standing in my backyard, looking out towards the tree line. The hair on my arms will stand up. That cold, heavy feeling of being watched will settle over me. I'll catch a whiff of something on the air, just damp leaves probably, or a neighbor's dog, and my heart will lurch into my throat. I never saw it again. I don't know what it was. A bear standing weirdly, a person in a strange fur coat. My brain has tried to come up with 1,000 logical explanations over the years, but they all crumble to dust when I remember the sheer wrongness of its proportions, the predatory stillness, and that silent, unwavering gaze. It was just there, and then it was gone. But it never really left. I can still see it, clear as day, hunched and gripping that tree, a silent watcher from the edge of the ravine, its moss-colored fur glowing in the ghost light of a long-ago moon.